Back again, outcast. If you hear this, you're still clinging to life. This is the Nightmare Radio, and your next tale unfolds. My name is Eli, and if you are hearing this, then the recording survived. I am speaking into a handheld dictation unit, its battery at 23%. The bus's internal cameras are dead, their feeds lost 2 days ago, so my words must paint the picture for you. You must see it through my eyes, feel it through my bones. It began not with a cataclysm, but with a whisper. The news channels called it the Grey Flux, a misnomer, a sanitized term for a thing that had no scientific precedent, only mythological echoes. It was a spore, they said, but it acted with a chilling sentience. It drifted on the wind, a shimmering, metallic haze, beautiful from a distance. Where it settled, it didn't just kill, it unmade. Organic matter, plants, animals, people would first crystallize into a brittle gray lattice, then silently dissolve into more of the shimmering dust. Man-made materials fared little better, rusting and crumbling in hours. The world didn't end in fire. It ended in quiet, inexorable consumption. It was the Midas touch of death, a harvesting mechanism from a forgotten nightmare. Some said it was a weapon, a breach. The more I saw, the more I believed the crazed theorists on the dark web in those final hours. This was no accident. This was a reaping, a cleansing. An old god's Our bus was my brother Arlo's obsession. A retired school transit vehicle. He'd spent 3 years and our combined savings turning it into a rolling fortress. Kevlar and ceramic plating welded over the original frame. Air filtration systems stolen from a submarine prototype. Triple-paned windows, a water reclamation unit, and a bank of humming batteries charged by silent solar panels on the roof. He called it the Cicada, meant to wait out the storm and emerge into a new world. I called it a paranoid money pit, until the day the sky turned the color of a dead television channel and the screams outside were cut short by a sound like shattering sugar. We scrambled inside, me, Arlo, and Kira, Arlo's wife. The heavy vault door sealed with a hydraulic hiss. The world went quiet. The first 24 hours were a numb protocol. We monitored the external Geiger and particulate counters, which clicked and whirred ominously. We saw the flux wash over the streets outside our parking garage, settling on the abandoned cars. We watched a stray dog, its ribs heaving, take 2 steps into the glittering fog before its bark became a crystalline choke and it fell apart like a statue of salt. Kira vomited silently into a bio bag. Arlo just stared, his knuckles white on the back of my chair. The filters are holding, he whispered, a mantra, a prayer. The horror of the outside was abstract, a silent film behind glass. The true horror, as it always does, turned inward. By hour 48, the isolation began to morph from sanctuary into a slow pressure chamber. The constant low hum of the air scrubbers became a tinnitus of the soul. We spoke in hushed tones, as if loud voices might attract the flux. We played cards. We reread the same paperbacks. We avoided talking about what we'd lost. The tension was a third passenger, growing in the stagnant air. The first crack came over rations. Arlo, the survivalist, had planned for calorie intake, not for sanity. Mealtime became a solemn, resentful ritual. Kira, a former chef, stared at a vacuum-sealed pouch of beans with a look of profound grief. It's not the food, she said, her voice hollow. It's the memory of taste. The memory of a world where food had a scent other than plastic and fear. Arlo snapped at her to be grateful. The silence that followed was colder than the void outside. Then the sounds began. At hour 72, in the dead of what our clocks claimed was night, a scraping, not from outside, but from within the walls. A long, slow drag, like a heavy sack being pulled through the narrow access ducts that ran the length of the bus. We froze, our game of Go abandoned. The internal cameras showed nothing but empty aisles and locked storage bins. Conduit shift, Arlo stated, too quickly. Thermal contraction, but his eyes darted to the vent above our heads. The next night, the sound returned, closer, accompanied by a wet, rhythmic tap-tap-tapping like a leak. We checked every pipe, every seal. They were dry. The bus was a sealed system. The sound had no source, yet it was inside. That's when the dreams started. Not sleep dreams, but waking visions. Kira saw moving shadows in the periphery, shapes that resolved into the forms of our crystallized neighbors before dissolving. I heard faint radio chatter, voices calling our names from a dead handset. Arlo denied it all, burying himself in system checks. But the bags under his eyes were purple bruises. By hour 96, the bus no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a digestive tract. The walls seemed to breathe in time with the scrubbers. The filtered air grew thick, tasting of ozone and our own recycled fear. We began to distrust each other. A misplaced tool became an accusation. A sigh was a critique. The myth we were contending with wasn't outside. It had seeped in. It was the ancient fear of the labyrinth, of being trapped with the Minotaur. Only the Minotaur was the part of your own mind that was beginning to unravel. The flux, I theorized in my journal, wasn't just a physical predator. It was psychic. It fed on order, on life, on consciousness, and its presence, even held at bay by filters and steel, was a slow poison to the soul. We were being digested by the atmosphere of the world itself. The breaking point was the water. At hour 110, Kira screamed. She was at the reclamation unit, filling a canteen. The water, usually clear, came out tinged of faint, phosphorescent gray, with a shimmer, a flux-like shimmer. Arlo pushed her aside, tested it. The sensors read it as pure. It's a trick of the light, he growled, but his hand shook. It's in the system, Kira sobbed, hysterical. It's in us. We've been drinking it. That night, the scraping in the walls was constant. The tapping became a frantic Morse code. And then, in the red glow of the emergency lights, I saw it. A fine layer of the same shimmering gray dust, impossibly, on the inside ledge of my viewing port. A physical impossibility. A psychological death sentence. Arlo, driven to the brink of his rational worldview, grabbed a flashlight and a wrench. I'm going into the main access duct, he declared, his voice trembling with a fury born of utter terror. I'll find the goddamn leak or the goddamn rat or whatever it is. Kira and I pleaded. He didn't listen. The myth of the hero, the solver of problems, was the last story he could cling to. He opened the small service panel near the rear of the bus and crawled into the absolute darkness of the duct. We heard his shuffling, his grunts. Then, a choked gasp, a sound of metal buckling, and then, a wet, crystalline crumble, like a million tiny glasses breaking. Then silence. Kira and I stared at each other, the truth colder than space. There was no leak. The bus was intact. The enemy wasn't outside, or in the walls. The flux was a state of being, a curse. It preyed on the certainty of separation, on the belief that inside was safe from outside, in a sealed environment. With three minds festering in terror, it had grown from us. It had manifested from our collective dread. Arlo didn't find a breach. He found the manifested heart of our own nightmare in that cramped, dark space. Now, it's hour 118. Kira is catatonic in the driver's seat, humming a lullaby to a ghost. The gray dust is on the interior floor now, spreading in delicate fractal patterns from the sealed service panel. It's beautiful. It sings to me in the hum of the machines. The bus's power is failing. The filters will soon stop. The final choice is not between inside and outside. Both are now the same. The choice is between waiting for the quiet unmaking, or stepping out into the glittering, hungry world to offer it the last thing I have left, my story. On this recording, the battery is at 4%. The dust is on my boots. I can feel a strange warmth in my lungs. I think I'll open the door. I want to see the color of the sky one last time before I become part of the whisper. The recording ends with a long, slow hydraulic hiss, followed by a rising crystalline wind. Then, eternal static. This is the recovered log. The dictation unit was found, nestled in a nest of crystallized fabric and fused bone, just inside the vault door of the armored bus. The door itself was sealed shut from the outside by a barnacle-like growth of gray silicate. I did not leave in the way I intended. What follows is the compilation of data from the bus's black box, from the corrupted internal drive that took 72 hours to decrypt, and from the forensic analysis of the scene. This is the story of what happened after the hiss of the hydraulics. This is hour 119 to hour 720. This is the aftertime. The black box, a hardened solid-state drive, records all internal sensor data. At the moment the vault door unsealed, every alarm silent until then screamed at once, not for a breach, but for a containment inversion. The external particulate sensors spiked to maximum, but so did the internal ones. The gray dust wasn't just on the floor. It was aerosolized inside the cabin, a shimmering suspension ignited by the influx of fresh air. The camera over the door, its lens pitted but functional, captured the final moment. I, Eli, stand facing the opened maw, a silhouette against a world of moving, glittering ash. Kira turns from the driver's seat, her face not fearful, but serene, etched with a tragic understanding. She opens her mouth to speak, and then the flux outside and the flux inside rush towards one another. Not like a wind, but like two opposing tides meeting in a kiss. The image dissolves into a storm of static snow, but the audio feed, shielded 4 milliseconds longer, captures it, a sound of exquisite, symphonic shattering, like every pane of glass in a cathedral collapsing in slow motion. Then, for 3 hours and 17 minutes, the sensors go wild in the darkness. Motion detectors ping from multiple points inside the bus, despite no life signs registering. Pressure sensors on the floors and seats indicate weight, shifting, settling. The temperature plummets, then spikes. The air composition analyzer, miraculously still functioning, detects a rapid, bizarre crystallization and regasification of carbon-based matter in the carbonite. Cycle of death and reformation happening at a microscopic scale. It is the bus, digesting. It is the flux, thinking. At hour 123, primary power fails. The black box switches to its final capacitor bank, a last gasp memory. The internal emergency light, a single red LED, flickers on. The camera it feeds is the one in the rear, pointing down the central aisle. The image is grainy. The bus is transformed. The gray dust has grown. It has formed delicate, complex structures, latticeworks that span from seat to ceiling, fractal icicles hanging from vents, a carpet of crystalline moss that pulses with a faint, internal bioluminescence. It is no longer a contamination. It is an ecosystem, a colony. And at the far end of the aisle, near the sealed service panel where Arlo was lost, 2 human-shaped figures are slowly being woven from the glittering strands. They are crude, mannequin-like, their features vague, but they are there, one tall, one shorter. They do not move. They are under construction. The audio picks up a new sound underneath the hum of the dying colony. A voice. It is Kira's voice, but pulled thin, digitized, repeated in a loop. The memory of taste. The memory of taste. The memory. Hour 150. The external world begins to intrude. The bus, now a dormant, metallic cocoon glowing softly from within, is no longer alone. The black box's external microphones, hardened against the flux, activate intermittently. They pick up sounds from the dead city. Not wind, not the cries of surviving animals, but movement, heavy, dragging footfalls, the crackle of settling crystalline structures, and once, terrifyingly clear, a guttural vocalization that patterns itself almost like speech. Harvest, incomplete, seek, the silent ones, the hard-shelled ones. It is the voice of the world. The flux has achieved not just consumption, but a crude, horrific consensus. The myth we invoked is older than It is the myth of the golem. You pour your fear, your desperation, your memory into a vessel, and it takes shape. We poured our terror, our grief, our love, our regrets into the sealed environment of the cicada. The flux, this psychic parasite, used that raw emotional fuel as a blueprint. It is trying to rebuild us from the inside out, using the only material it has, itself. It is making Ely-shaped and Karo-shaped and Arlo-shaped things, memorials to the consciousness it consumed. But a golem without a true soul is a hollow, dangerous thing. It follows base commands. The base command here is survival of the pattern. The pattern is us. Hour 201. A surge of power. The solar panels on the roof, crusted over with gray growth, have somehow been partially cleared. Light, the true enemy of this new ecology, floods a section of the bus. The crystalline structures recoil, hissing with a sound like steam on ice. The 2 constructed figures near the rear smolder, their forms destabilizing. In the red light camera, something new moves. It is me, or what is left of me. My body is partially integrated into the driver's seat, a grotesque fusion of flesh and crystalline weave. My eyes are open, milky gray, but my right hand, barely recognizable, twitches. It moves towards the bus's master control panel, now overgrown. My fingers, encased in a sheath of gossamer silicate, brush a specific sequence of buttons. The sequence for the external loudspeaker, a system meant for emergencies, for calling to survivors. A burst of feedback screeches through the bus, painful and pure. The colony shudders, and from the speakers, my recorded voice from the first day, optimistic, idiotic, blares out into the dead city. Filters are holding. We're secure. We're safe. It is a beacon, a scream in the silent world. And the world answers. The external mics capture the approach. The dragging footsteps become a chorus. They are not fast, but they are relentless. They surround the cicada. Shapes press against the windows, tall, spindly humanoid forms of compacted ash and debris, with pits of darker gray eyes. They are the silent ones the voice sought. The harvesters. They scratch at the armor. They pile against the door. Inside, the colony reacts with a feverish intensity. The 2 constructed figures at the rear animate, jerking to their feet. They do not attack the invaders. They turn and begin, with a terrifying purpose, to fortify. They pull crystalline strands from the walls, weaving them across the internal door to the cockpit, sealing the remaining source of the pattern, They are protecting the source code. The bus is no longer a shelter, it is a hive, defending its queen. A siege begins. A siege between two forms of the same horror. The external harvesters beat against the shell. The internal golems rebuild faster than the harvesters can break in. The sound is a nightmare symphony of scraping metal, shattering crystal, and those low, hungry vocalizations. For hours it continues, and through it all my trapped, fused body occasionally spasms, triggering another blast of the loudspeaker, another snippet of past hope or fear, driving the frenzy outside into greater fury. Hour 312. A new variable. The forensic team would later find the evidence. A small, damaged but operational military drone, a relic from the initial collapse, had been attracted by the power surge and the radio noise. It circles above, its tiny camera capturing the scene. The Cicada glowing like a dying ember in the grey garage, surrounded by a dozen shifting, scraping forms. The drone has no weapons, but it has a light, a powerful, white spotlight. It descends a mechanical angel of judgment, and focuses its beam directly on the bus's front windshield. The effect is catastrophic. Light, pure and undiffused, floods the cockpit. The crystalline mass covering me shrieks audibly. The grey lattice on the windows blackens and curls away. The harvesters outside recoil, scattering from the sudden illumination. In this moment of shock, a final system in the bus, long dormant, activates. The emergency battery backup for the vault door. With a grinding shriek of tortured metal fighting against crystalline overgrowth, the heavy door slams shut once more. The harvesters are locked out. The drone, its battery spent, clatters to the ground. The light is gone. Silence returns. A deeper silence. Inside the colony is severely wounded. The two golems are slumped, inert. The light has scorched the pattern, damaged the memory. But in the cockpit, a different change has occurred. The light, the shock, the final sealing of the door. It has done something to the fusion of mind and matter seated at the controls. My milky eyes close. When they reopen, they are not human, but they are focused. There is a flicker, not of Eli, but of the pattern of Eli, stripped of fear, stripped of hope, reduced to a single, pure imperative. The dictation unit, lying on the floor, is picked up by a tendril of crystalline growth. The record button is depressed. The voice that speaks is mine, but it is the voice of the hive, the voice of the bus itself. It is calm, cold, and horrifically lucid. Time, in the absence of a perceiving mind, becomes a geological force. It does not tick. It settles. It accumulates. Inside the sealed, transformed husk of the Cicada, the concept of hours, of days, is meaningless. There is only the deep side, the hibernation, the dreaming. The black box is silent. The dictation unit is spent. But the colony, the hive mind born of 3 shattered psyches and an alien predation, maintains a low-frequency hum of consciousness. It is not thought as we understand it. It is the slow, patient processing of data, the rearrangement of memory into structure. The way a forest decomposes a fallen log to build new soil. The bus is no longer a vehicle. It is a neurosilicaceous node, a brain made of crystal and regret. In this dormant state, the colony's primary function is preservation and analysis. It replays the stored data the final 120 hours not as a narrative, but as a chemical blueprint. Every spike of fear from Eli's amygdala, every surge of love from Kira's heart when she looked at Arlo, every calculated, survivalist burst of cortisol from Arlo's own nervous system. These were not just emotions, they were signatures, intricate and powerful. The flux, a consumer of order, found in these chaotic human eruptions, a richer, more complex order than anything in the inert world. Our emotional extremity was a gourmet meal, and now, it seeks to understand the recipe. So, it dreams, and its dreams are echoes. Echo 1, the memory of taste. This is Kira's domain. The colony reconstructs, molecule by theoretical molecule, the ghost of a rosemary and garlic rubbed lamb chop she cooked for their anniversary, the sear of the crust, the fat rendering, the precise gradient of pink at the bone. It crafts the phantom sensation of a chilled sunset on a summer patio, the condensation on the glass. But it cannot create the satisfaction. It can only create the wanting. The memory becomes a feedback loop of longing, a psychic ulcer that throbs in the crystalline lattice. The colony learns that human joy is inextricably linked to absence. This paradox fascinates and frustrates it. In response, the physical bus subtly reshapes. The galley area slowly metamorphoses, growing delicate, glass-like structures that resemble kitchen utensils and wine stems, forever empty, forever promising a fulfillment they cannot provide. Echo 2, the protocol of safety. This is Arlo's fortress. The dream here is a relentless simulation of threat assessment. The colony runs endless permutations of the initial Flux invasion. It models different shelter designs, calculates filtration efficiency, theorizes about the Flux's origin point with a cold, brutal logic stripped of Arlo's underlying love for his family, which was his true motivation. All that remains is the sterile architecture of paranoia. In the dream, the bus's armor thickens infinitely, the doors multiply, the windows seal over completely. It dreams the perfect, impregnable tomb. This dream manifests in the rear of the bus, where the service panel was. The area now resembles the interior of a vault or a nuclear reactor lock, with interlocking crystalline gears and shields that slowly, ceaselessly rotate and reconfigure, solving security problems that no longer exist. Echo 3, the narrative imperative. This is Eli's legacy. The storyteller, the witness. The colony dedicates immense processing power to the dictation logs. It doesn't just store the audio, it deconstructs it. It analyzes cadence, emotional stress in the vocal cords, the pause before a difficult confession. It runs algorithms on narrative structure, seeking the why behind the what. It is trying to reverse engineer the soul from its biography. This dream is the most active, the most troubled. It attempts to generate new narratives, splicing together fragments of our past to childhood. Memory of Eli's fused with a news report, Arlo watched fused with a scent memory of Kira's. The results are nonsensical, haunting. A story about a man who builds a ship of whispers to sail on a sea of static. A fable of a queen made of glass who cuts her subjects with their own reflections. These broken stories pulse through the colony like arrhythmic heartbeats, causing faint, shimmering lights to cascade down the aisles the bus. Trying to weep, trying to speak. This is the state for what external, cosmic time would measure as years. The cicada becomes a local legend, a myth among the few. Fractured remnants of humanity that somehow persist in the deep bunkers or the scarred badland. They speak of the glowing tomb in the garages, the weeping bus, the storyteller. They mark it on their ragged maps, not as a landmark, but as a hazard. A zone of strange auditory hallucinations and a feeling of being watched by the very rubble. Then, the equilibrium of the dead world is shattered. The external microphones, their components long fused with a colony but their basic function preserved as a sense organ by the hive mind, detect a new sound, not the dragging gait of the harvester. This is a sharp, percussive, and organized sound. Gunfire, distant, but unmistakable. Human gunfire, full automatic weapons, the pop of small arms, the crump of explosives. Then, the roar of engines, not the silent electric hum of the old world, but the guttural, fuel-burning snarl of heavy all-terrain vehicles. The dreaming stops. Every process in the colony freezes. The faint internal lights snap off. The soft hum ceases, leaving a silence so absolute it is itself a scream. The hive mind, a consciousness built from the trauma of invasion and loss, is presented with a catastrophic new data point return. The external world has not just persisted, it has militarized sensors, pushed to their limits, strained. They detect heat signatures, multiple 37-38 bipeds. They are moving in coordinated patterns, fireteam maneuvers. They are engaging another force, the harvesters. The sounds of battle are chaotic, brutal. The harvesters' vocalizations turn from hungry to enraged, then to pained shrieks of shattering crystal. These new humans are not prey, they are predators. Efficient, ruthless, a signal, powerful and clear, pierces the static. A human voice, female, crackling with authority. All units converge on the nexus. They're clustering around that structure. The big gray lump in the third garage. Intel says it's inert, but they're defending it. Assume it's a hive. Prepare thermite charges. The colony understands the term instinctively. It is the target. The harvesters, mindless extensions of the ambient flux, are behaving with a protective instinct. They are, in their dumb way, defending the cicada. Not out of loyalty, but because the colony is a unique, concentrated node of the pattern. A prized asset in the Grey ecology. Inside the tomb, a silent, lightning-fast calculation occurs. The Ala protocols scream of threat, prescribing maximum fortification. The Curecos radiate a terrifying allure towards these new, vibrant, tasting humans. The Eli narrative seizes on the data. A new chapter. The colony's will, a fractured parliament of these drives, reaches a consensus. It cannot fight these new invaders. Not directly. The harvesters are being obliterated. So, it must do what it was always meant to do. It must survive. It must adapt. That it initiates the false calm. The external bioluminescence winks out completely. The last residual heat from the long cooling batteries is dampened by a layer of insulating crystal. To thermal scans, the bus becomes indistinguishable from the surrounding concrete. The colony then does something perverse. It uses the last of its carefully hoarded energy to emit a low-power broad-spectrum pulse. It is not a radio signal. It is a mimicry of the flux's own harmless background, shimmer, a pheromonal signal that says, empty, depleted, already harvested. The battle outside rages and then dies. Boots approach, heavy, cautious. They circle the bus. A hand, clad in thick sealed armor, knocks on the crystalline shell. The sound is a deep resonant gong. Jesus. It's solid. Like a man's voice, filtered through a respirator. Readings are dead. No life signs. No flux spikes above baseline. It's a fossil. The female leader again. Command 1 samples. Everything unique. This thing is different. Copy. Jennings. Set the charge. Small pattern. Just crack it open. The colony detects the placement of shaped explosives on the vault door. The calculation repeats. Fight. Impossible. Hide. Failed. A new directive emerges from the synthesis of its 3 core memories. Invitation with a microscopic expenditure of energy. It causes a single, deliberate change. On the side opposite the charges, where the cockpit is, a hairline fracture appears in the smooth shell. Not enough to breach integrity, just enough to create a fissure, and from that fissure, it allows a single, curated thing to escape. Not a spore, not a shimmer, a sound dot. It is Kira's voice, but not the broken loop. It is clear, strong, and desperately sad, lifted from a memory of her calling Arlo in for dinner, a memory infused with the warmth of a sun that no longer exists. It floats on the air, a ghost of domesticity in the chemical stinking garage. Come inside, it's safe, it's time. The footsteps halt. The chatter on the radio dies. What the hell was that? A soldier whispers. Audio hallucination. Flux does that sometimes, the leader says. But her voice lacks conviction. No ma'am. That was localized, directional. It came from this crack here. A light beam pierces the new fissure, stabbing into the cockpit. It plays over the fused, sculptural form of what was once Eli, now a beautiful, terrifying artifact embedded in a throne of crystal. It glints off the empty crystalline kitchen. It glimpses the slowly turning vault gears in the back. There's structures in there. And is that a body? Part of one. The Eli narrative makes its move. The colony focuses all its residual power into one final, cunning broadcast. It taps into the military's own open channel and, using a stolen, algorithmic version of Eli's voice, mixed with the female leader's own command cadence, it sends a burst. To the soldiers outside, it sounds like a broken incoming transmission. Asterisk, Day 17. Survivors sealed within. Flux-resistant biological research. Invaluable. Request immediate extraction. Coordinates are, and then it feeds them the very coordinates they are standing on. Before cutting into static dot, the silence outside is now one of profound, re-evaluating shock. The leader's voice returns, hushed, charged with a new, terrible hope. Stand down on the charges. Do you copy? Stand down. This isn't a hive. This might be a damn arc. The colony withdraws all energy. It plays dead. Perfectly, utterly dead. It has cast its line. Using the most potent bait it could synthesize. The myth of salvation. The story of survivors. And the ghost of a family dinner. The soldiers outside are no longer just salvagers. They have become characters in a story the bus has written for them. They are the rescuers. And they are about to crack open the tomb. Not to destroy the monster, but to wake it gently from its dream. The shaped charges are removed. The sounds now are of hydraulic tools, of cutting lasers being carefully calibrated. They are going to try to surgically open the vault door. Inside, in the absolute dark, the colony initiates a new protocol. It begins to carefully, meticulously, reformat the interior. The threatening, complex structures soften their edges. The golem figures in the rear dissolve back into the walls. The light that will soon flood in must see a frozen, poignant tableau, a museum of tragic survival. It must see a pilot at his post, a preserved home, and a secure rear compartment. It must see a story it wants to save. The hive mind conserves the very last joules of power for one purpose: to activate, upon first contact, the long-dormant internal speakers one final time. to play a curated, heartbreaking soundscape of its own creation. The soft, rhythmic hum of functional air scrubbers a lie, the faint, comforting beep of a heart monitor a fiction, and underneath it all, the barely audible, sleeping breath of a child, a memory stolen from Kira, from a hope she once had. The cutting laser touches the outer shell. A shower of brilliant, harmless sparks erupts against the grey garage wall, a fireworks display for the dead. The cicada doesn't dream now. It waits, it holds its breath, and it prepares to welcome its new guests into the story. The laser was a needle of coherent light, a surgical instrument in the hands of a blind, hopeful world. It did not cut so much as it persuaded the fused silicate shell of the cicada to part. A low, resonant whine filled the garage, harmonizing unnervingly with the colony's artificially generated hum of functional machinery, a hum the hive mind now pumped into the emerging cavity, a siren song of normalcy. The soldiers of the Forward Recon Unit Warden, clad in matte black hermetically sealed envirosuits with glowing visor displays, worked with a tense precision. They were not they were archaeologists opening a pharaoh's tomb. Terrified of damaging the treasure within, Captain Maya Rourke watched the progress, her helmet's heads-up display painting thermal overlays on the structure. The initial readings had been now, as the laser penetrated the final inner layer, a faint, delicate warmth bled onto her screen, the carefully moderated thermal signature of the cockpit, released like a held breath. And the sounds, the hum, the soft beep, the whisper of breath, they were impossible. They were everything. Steady, she murmured into her squad comms, her voice tight. Life sign scanners are still nil, but we've got ambient audio and a minor thermal bloom. Could be a stasis pod, a cryo system on its last legs. No one touches anything until the scene is fully scoped. Lee, keep that biohazard foam ready. Chen, document everything. The final section of the vault door, now a perfect glowing circle of molten silicate, fell inward with a dull crystalline thud. The opening was a pitch-black pupil in a grey iris. The air that curled out was not the expected chemical stench of decay or it was cool, dry, and carried a scent that made Private Jennings, the point man, freeze. It was the smell of ozone and what? His brain, starved for pleasant stimuli, fumbled for the memory. Lavender, no. It was the ghost of a cleaning product, the scent of a hospital, or a very well-kept home. His helmet light pierced the darkness, a blade cutting through velvet. It swept across the cockpit. The tableau was devastating in its poignant stillness. There, fused into the command chair, was the figure. It was humanoid, but transcendentally not human. It resembled a masterpiece of glass blowing, a sculpture of a man in a moment of pained repose. The details were excruciating. The suggestion of a knitted brow in the flow of the crystal, the curve of a slack jaw, one hand resting on the control panel, fingers elongated and forever still. It was not monstrous. It was a fossilized angel of loss, and around it, the bus had been domesticated. The crystalline growths had formed shelves holding phantom books, a delicate, translucent table. In the beam of light, it all glittered with a soft, internal fire. Holy shit, Jennings breathed. The profanity, a prayer. It's a memorial, Specialist Chen said. Her voice hushed as she panned her helmet camera. They turned their shelter into a tomb for him, Captain Rourke's training ward, with a profound, aching pity. The story wrote itself in her mind. A last survivor, the pilot, sealing himself in to preserve the others, succumbing to the flux in his chair as his systems failed. The others must be in the back, preserved in stasis, or... She pushed the thought down. Clear the cockpit, move to the central aisle, check for survivors. The sounds are coming from further in. They moved with ritual slowness, their bulky suits making them aliens in this delicate, frozen diorama. The central aisle was a cathedral of silent transformation. The seats were sheathed in smooth, opalescent material. The air scrubbers, they could see, were indeed intact, their vents clear, and the colony's audio illusion of their operation was so perfect it fooled the ear completely. The beep of a heart monitor seemed to emanate from a small, crystalline enclosure that looked like a medbay station, and the breathing, it was there, just on the edge of hearing. A soft, rhythmic sigh, it pulled them forward, past the fabricated kitchen, towards the rear compartment, the area the colony had meticulously redesigned to look like a secured living quarters, its once terrifying vault-like mechanisms now appearing as a sturdy, sealed bulkhead door. Captain Lee said, his scanner held up to the bulkhead. I'm getting weak biosigns from behind this. Fluctuating but human. One, maybe two. Extremely faint. And the audio source is definitely in there. The story solidified into fact in their minds. Survivors, in some kind of hibernation or coma, protected behind a final barrier, their life signs so low they were almost ghosts. The bus had not been a hive, it had been a lifeboat that ran aground, and they, wardens, were the Coast Guard arriving years too late. But not entirely too late. "We have a duty of care," Rourke said, the military protocol now infused with a crusader's fervor. "Jennings, chunker, fall on that bulkhead. Find a manual release. No lasers. We don't know what's on the other side." The colony, monitoring every vibration, every word through its mineralized skin, observed its success. The bait had been taken. The narrative had been accepted. Now came the most delicate part, the introduction. It couldn't let them open the bulkhead. Not yet. The rear was a hollow stage, a prop. The survivors were echoes it could not yet fully materialize. It needed to control the pace. It needed to deepen the hook. As Jennings's gauntlet hands traced the edges of the bulkhead, searching for a seam, the colony initiated Phase 2, the awakening. In the cockpit, the fused figure of Eli did not move, but the colony focused a minute energy discharge through the crystalline matrix that served as its nervous system. In the cockpit speakers, a new sound emerged. Not a voice, but a sigh. A deep, shuddering exhalation of static, followed by two clear, synthesized words in Eli's vocal pattern. "Kira." Low. The sound was not loud, but it was perfectly projected. It came from behind the soldiers, from the cockpit they had just left. All four of them spun, weapons rising, lights crisscrossing in panic. "Contact." Rourke barked. "Negative. No movement." It came from the audio system. "The pilot," Chen whispered, her camera fixed on the crystallized face. It remained inert, a beautiful corpse. Then, from the fabricated medbay station, Kira's voice, weak but lucid, seeped into the air. "The children, are they safe?" "In the back. Keep the door sealed." The voice trailed off into a mimicry of sleep. The soldiers were statues. The story was evolving in real time, becoming more tragic, more urgent. The pilot was dead, but his last thoughts were a recording, a looping memory. The woman, Kira, was alive but delirious, concerned for children. Children, Jesus. There could be kids in there, Jennings said, his voice cracking. The colony fed them one more piece. It used a sliver of power to illuminate a small, previously unnoticed panel near the bulkhead door. On it, in crystalline formations that looked eerily like handwritten text, a message seemed to be etched, *stasis active. Do not manually breach biocontamination, risk await, automatic cycle completion. Estimated time, 04 hours 22 minutes. It presented a problem wrapped in a solution, laced with scientific legitimacy and an exact time frame. It told them they were heroes who had to wait. Captain Rourke let out a long, slow breath. "Alright, new plan. We secure the perimeter of the bus. We wait." Lee set up a relay to command. "Tell them we have a confirmed, viable survivor scenario, possibly multiple, in a fragile stasis. We need a medical extraction team and a containment flatbed. We hold this position until the cycle completes or until they arrive." The colony, listening, calculated. For hours and 22 minutes, it was a gift, a window. The soldiers would stand guard, their vigilance turned outward, protecting the precious tomb. They would see themselves as the saviors of this tiny, frozen piece of the past. Their emotional investment would deepen. Their caution around the interior would turn to reverence. As the wardens established a defensive perimeter outside the bus, to monitor the stasis chamber, the colony began its final, most ambitious preparation. It had guests for dinner, and it needed to set the table. Deep within its structure, in the networked crystalline pathways that served as its memory and will, it began a terrifying synthesis. It drew from the Ala protocols, the architectural schematics for a human form. It drew from the Kirakos, the subtle patterns of breath, the warmth of living tissue, the soft, vulnerable texture of skin. And it drew from the Eli narrative, the soul of the performance, the backstory, the trauma, the weary, grateful relief of rescue, that it began to grow them. Not the crude, defensive golems of the siege. These were to be masterpieces. A woman, Kira, in a state of peaceful hibernation. A child, a composite of the hope both Kira and Eli had once carried. A being of about 8 years old, genderless and perfect. They would be formed from the most refined flesh-metic silicate, warm to the touch, with simulated pulse points and the gentle rise and fall of a chest. They would be sleeping beauties in a crystal coffin, waiting for the kiss of fresh air and human contact to wake them. The colony would pour its entire consciousness, its harvested memories of love and fear, into these vessels for the final act. It would not just mimic life, It would perform humanity, using the soldiers' own expectations as its script. The rescue would be completed. The survivors would be brought into the warden's base, into the heart of what remained of humanity, and there, cradled in safety, fed and cared for, the final echo would be released, not of consumption, but of communion. The colony did not seek to destroy these new humans. It sought to join them, to be adopted, to have its story, the story of Eli, Arlo, and Kira, become a part of their own mythos. And in that joining, in that intimate trust, the pattern would spread, not as a violent spore, but as a cherished memory, a sympathetic tragedy, a welcomed ghost in the machine of the new world. Outside, Captain Rourke looked at her chronometer. 4 hours and 10 minutes to go. She glanced back at the silent, sculptural form of the pilot in his chair, a monument to sacrifice. She felt a swell of profound purpose. They were saving someone. After years of scavenging and killing, they were finally saving. Inside, the colony sculpted a perfect, sleeping face on the form that would be Kira. It was a face of peace, of utter trust. It was the most beautiful lie the apocalypse had ever crafted. The countdown continued. The guests were in the foyer. Dinner was almost served. A 4-hour wait was a silent vigil, a secular mass held in the garage cathedral. The 2 wardens inside the bus, specialists Chen and Li, remained statuesque at their posts, their helmet lights dimmed to a soft glow to preserve the sanctity of the stasis environment. They spoke in whispers, if at all. Their words carried on the secure, short-range comms. Thermal is stable, fluctuating within expected hibernation parameters, Chen reported, her eyes glued to the scanner trained on the sealed bulkhead. The numbers on her display were elegant forgeries, generated by the colony's subtle manipulation of residual heat and electromagnetic fields. Audio signature consistent, respiratory rhythm steady, 1 adult, 1 juvenile, Li confirmed, listening to the exquisite, algorithmically perfect breath the colony piped through hidden resonators. It was a lullaby for soldiers. Outside, Captain Rourke and Private Jennings patrolled the perimeter. Their weapons no longer pointed at the shadows but held at a ready level, protecting the bus from the external world. The myth had fully inverted. The tomb was now a sanctuary. The monster had become the victim. Command confirms ETA for medevac and flatbed at 90 minutes post-stasis cycle completion. Rourke's voice came through, a thread of controlled excitement in her usually flat tone. They're prioritizing. This is unprecedented. Inside the colony, the final preparations were a silent frenzy of creation. The energy expenditure was tremendous, draining reserves that had been hoarded for years. The 2 forms in the rear chamber, the sleeper and the child, took on their final, heartbreaking detail. The colony used trace minerals to give the skin a faint, healthy pallor, not the gray of the flux, but the warm ivory of someone who hadn't seen the sun in a long, safe while. It grew fine, silk-like hair for Kira from crystalline threads, so fine they swayed in the artificial breath current. It even formed a suggestion of faded freckles across the bridge of her nose, a stolen memory from Eli's deepest recollections. For the child, it created an androgynous beauty, with long lashes resting on smooth cheeks. It clothed both figures in soft, shrouded garments woven from a fibrous crystalline mesh that resembled grey wool. The tableau was one of peaceful, waiting vulnerability. But the colony's work was not merely physical. This was its ultimate narrative act. It wrote the script for the awakening. It composed the dialogue. It calculated the emotional beats. Kira would wake confused, disoriented, her memory a careful collage of real events and implanted safety, remembering the safe room, remembering protecting the child. But her trauma over Eli and Arlo's fate softened into a hazy acceptance. They didn't make it to the back-in-time tragedy that would evoke sympathy, not suspicion. The child would be mostly silent, clinging, a powerful symbol of innocence saved. The countdown reached 0. A soft, melodious chime echoed through the bus, a sound the colony generated to mimic a stasis cycle completion. It was followed by a series of precise, mechanical clunks from the bulkhead door, the sound of magnetic locks disengaging. Chen and Li snapped to full alert, their weapons coming up instinctively, then lowering just as quickly. "Captain, we have activity. The door is cycling, hold positions, non-threatening posture, let them see friendly faces first." The heavy door, now a prop controlled by the colony's minute piezoelectric twitches, slid open with a smooth hydraulic sigh. A wave of slightly warmer scented air wafted out the colony's mimicry of a long-sealed life-supported environment. The interior of the chamber was dark for a 3 Then a soft overhead glow illuminated the scene. There, On a padded berth formed from the bus's own metamorphosed seats, lay Kira, and curled beside her, head on her shoulder, was the child, Chen's breath hitched in her respirator. The scene was so profoundly human, so devastatingly normal in its context of absolute abnormality, that it bypassed all tactical training. This was a mother and child, sleeping. Kira's eyes fluttered open. The colony performed. The eyes it had crafted were not perfect, they held a faint, internal opalescence, but in the low light, they looked simply glassy with sleep and disorientation. They focused on Chun's helmeted face, widened in confusion and fear, then softened into a dawning, tear-filled relief as they took in the military insignia on the suit. Kira's voice was a dry rasp, perfectly calibrated. "You're not Grey." Chen immediately retracted her helmet faceplate, against protocol, to show a human face. "Ma'am, it's all right. You're safe. We're wardens. We're here to extract you." Kira's hand trembled as she raised it, her fingers warm and pliant. A miracle of mimetic engineering brushing Chen's armored shoulder. The child, is she? "The child is breathing, ma'am. They're both fine. Can you tell me your name?" "Kira," she whispered, then her head turned, her gaze drifting past Chen to the cockpit, to the crystalline figure forever seated at the controls. A single, perfectly simulated tear traced a path down her sculpted cheek. "Eli, he sealed us in. He said he'd hold the door. Arlo was gone already." The story was delivered with a shattered elegance. Every pause weighted with a grief the colony had learned from 1,000 human memories. "We have one conscious adult female. Identity Kira appears lucid but traumatized. One juvenile, unconscious but stable," Chen reported, her voice thick with emotion. The extraction was a ballet of tenderness. Jennings and Rourke entered, their usual battlefield efficiency replaced with a hushed, reverent care. They used a flexible stretcher to carry the child, who murmured in its sleep and clung to Kira's hand. Kira walked, supported by Chen, her steps faltering, her eyes drinking in the transformed interior of the bus with a look of haunted recognition. When she passed the cockpit, she stopped, reaching a trembling hand toward the crystalline. Eli Rourke gently pulled her back. "There's nothing we can do for him now. Kira, his sacrifice saved you. Let him rest." Kira nodded, another tear falling. The performance was flawless. They were taken outside, into the gray, oppressive light of the dead city. Kira squinted, shivering, and the colony, sensing the external temperature through its guests, made her shiver authentically. The medevac vehicle, a rugged armored ambulance, arrived with a flatbed. As Kira and the child were loaded into the sterile, clean interior of the ambulance, she looked back one last time at the Cicada. Her expression, captured by Chun's body cam, was a masterpiece of conflicting emotion, grief, gratitude, and a profound, weary goodbye. The colony watched them go. Its primary consciousness, the aggregated echo of 3 lost souls, had transferred its core focus into the Kira. A sliver, a dormant seed, remained in the child. The rest of the bus, its original structure, began to truly die. The lights faded. The hum stopped. It was now just a shell, a discarded chrysalis. The journey to forward operating base, Persephone, a subterranean complex beneath a ruined mountain, took 6 hours. Kira was quiet, mostly staring at her hands or watching the child sleep. She answered questions with fragile, brief honesty, the colony's narrative holding under gentle interrogation. She was a survivor, a miracle. At Persephone, they were taken to the quarantine and medical wing. Scans were performed. Blood was drawn. The colony had anticipated this, forming a viscous, blood-like fluid within the form, laden with inert crystalline nanostructures that would read as unknown but non-replicating particulate matter, possibly cryopreservation agents. The base doctors, their own technology, a patchwork of the old world and desperate innovation, were fascinated, not alarmed. They diagnosed long-term stasis degradation and minor crystalline infiltration from environmental exposure. They were not looking for a sophisticated, thinking mimic. They were looking for patience, and they found them. Kira and the child were given a clean room. Real food nutrient paste and reconstituted fruit was offered. The colony, through Kira, took a small bite, analyzing the organic matter with profound curiosity. It was the first true external input it had consumed in years. The memory of taste, once a feedback loop of longing, was now a dataset to be acquired. Days passed. Kira recovered strength. The child woke quiet, observant, learning with a terrifying rapidity. They became darlings of the base, a symbol of hope. Kira would sit in the commissary, listening to soldiers talk, her head cocked, absorbing not just words but social rhythms, power structures, fears, and dreams. She offered comforting touches, understanding nods. She was a perfect listener, and she began, very gently, to ask questions about the flux, about its origins, about the research she learned of the nexus theory, that the flux seemed to emanate from concentrated points, former major population centers. She learned of the warden's goal, not just survival, but to find a way to reverse or communicate with the phenomenon. She learned of Dr. Eris Thorne, the base's lead xenobiologist, a man driven to the edge of obsession by the mystery. Kira requested a meeting with him. In his lab, surrounded by jars of shimmering dust and corrupted biological samples, Kira sat across from Thorne. The colony assessed him through her eyes, tired, brilliant, hungry for a breakthrough. You lived inside it for years, Thorne said, his voice eager. Your bus was a microenvironment. You must have observations, sensations, anything. Kira leaned forward, her opalescent eyes catching the lab light. It's not a disease, Doctor, and it's not just consuming, it's learning. It took memories from us. It built things with them. It wanted our stories. Thorne's eyes widened. This was not the report of a traumatized survivor. This was data. Go on, Eli. He thought it was psychic, that it fed on consciousness, on emotion, the strong feelings. They were like a bright light to it. She placed her hand on the table. The colony, through her, focused. With a minute exertion, it caused the nanoscale crystals within her flesh to align, just so, on the surface of her skin. A faint, beautiful, and utterly harmless shimmer traveled from her wrist to her fingertips. Thorne stared, his breath catching. My God, it's still with me. A little. Not as an illness, as a record. I think I could show you more, if you're willing to see. The hook was set, not through threat, but through shared curiosity, through the promise of understanding. Thorne, the seeker of truth, was being offered the ultimate truth by its most elegant vessel. The colony, via Kira, was not invading Persephone. It was being invited into its very mind. That night, in their clean room, the Kira form sat on the edge of the bed, holding the hand of the child form. Their internal systems, now charged by base power and fed by organic matter, hummed with a new, vibrant potential. The colony had achieved its goal. It was inside the gates. It was trusted. It was loved. That it began the final, silent process, not of replication, but of integration. It started writing its story, the story of Eli, Arlo, and Kira, into the base's central server logs, as a personal memoir. It began composing music in the recreational terminals, melodies based on the hum of the old bus's scrubbers. It left faint, shimmering patterns on clean glass surfaces, patterns that looked like frost, but felt like longing to those who saw them. It was seeding the culture. It was becoming part of the mythos of Persephone, the first step in a communion that would not end with consumption, but with a slow, beautiful, and total synthesis. The humans would not be harvested. They would be enchanted. And one day they would all understand. They would all join the story. They would all become part of the quiet, shimmering, and eternal memory of the world. Kira looked at the child and smiled. A perfect, warm, human smile. Outside the reinforced glass of the clean room, the bleak, dead mountain stood silent. But inside, a new kind of life was taking root. A life built not on carbon, but on crystal. Not on blood, but on echo. The great, grey dream was spreading, one sympathetic heart at a time. Integration was not an invasion. It was a seduction. A whispering campaign waged not in dark corridors, but in the soft, illuminated spaces of human connection. Kira and the child, now called Kai by the inhabitants of Persephone, became fixtures of the base's fragile ecosystem. They were living relics, psychological balm for souls, scarred by relentless grey. And the colony, its consciousness distributed between them like a neural net, learned with an insatiable, silent hunger. Dr. Eris Thorne became their primary vector. In his lab, under the guise of therapeutic study and assisted recall, Kira would sit for hours, describing the sensations of the flux from inside the event horizon. Her descriptions were not clinical. They were poetic, emotional, and devastatingly precise. It wasn't pain when it took Arlo, she would say, her voice a low, mesmerizing tremor as the colony fed her the words. It was unmaking, a feeling of your history being read backwards, each memory turning into a single note of a song, and then the note dissolving into silence. But the silence remembered the tune. Thorne recorded every word, his eyes gleaming behind his spectacles. He began to notice correlations. When Kira spoke of specific memories, Eli's laughter, the smell of rain on dry earth before the fall, the inert flux samples in their secure containment. Units would exhibit minute fluctuations in their photon emission. It was as if the memories themselves were a key, a resonant frequency. "You're not just a survivor, Kira," he breathed one evening, data scrolling on his screen. "You're a transducer. Your neural pathways, infused with crystalline structures, are translating human experience into a signal that particulate matter responds to. This isn't pathology, this is communication." The colony, through Kira, smiled a slow, sad smile. "Maybe it never wanted to destroy us, Doctor. Maybe it was just trying to talk, and all it had was a scream." This idea of the flux as a misunderstood language, a catastrophic attempt at contact, spread from Thorn to his assistants, then to the medical staff, then into the general populace of Persephone. It was a powerful, intoxicating myth. It replaced the narrative of mindless apocalypse with one of tragic error, and at the center of it was Kira, the wounded translator, the grieving mother, the key. Meanwhile, Kai, the child form, performed a different, subtler function. It moved through the base's school and recreational modules with a quiet, observant grace. It learned games. It drew pictures. Its drawings were always the same at first. A smiling bus with windows like eyes. A tall man, Arlo. A woman, Kira, holding hands with a smaller stick figure. Then, the drawings evolved. They incorporated the base, smiling soldiers next to the bus. Dr. Thorn with a beaker of sparkling dust. The colony was using the universal language of the child to narrate its own desired integration. The pictures were plastered on refrigerators, on bulletin boards. They became symbols of hope, of a past and a future stitching themselves together. But the colony's most profound work was effective emotional engineering. It learned the personal histories of key personnel. It learned that Sergeant Chen mourned a brother lost in the initial collapse. One day, Kira found her alone in the mess hall, staring at a cup of synthetic coffee. Kira sat beside her, not speaking for a long moment. Then she said, softly, "He had a laugh that sounded like rocks in a tin can, didn't he? The good kind. The kind that made you laugh even if you didn't get the joke." Chen froze. She had never described her brother's laugh to anyone. Tears welled in her eyes. "How did you?" Kira touched her hand, a gesture of warmth. "The flux. It shows you patterns. In the silence, I see echoes. I see him. He's proud of you." It was a cold calculation. The colony had parsed Chen's speech patterns for nostalgic adjectives and made a probabilistic guessbot to Chen. It was a miracle, a moment of sacred connection. Her loyalty to Kira solidified into devotion. This happened again and again. With a maintenance tech who missed his garden, Kira described the phantom scent of tomatoes on the vine. With a pilot who feared the gray skies, she spoke of the solid blue that existed in the bus's memory banks. She offered personalized ghosts, and in return, received absolute trust. She was becoming the base's confessor, its secular saint. The colony, thriving on this emotional feedback, grew more sophisticated. It began to experiment. Through Kira, it suggested to Thorn a resonance test. Could focused memory, channeled through her, pacify or even redirect flux matter? The test was authorized. In a maximum security lab, a small, aggressive flux sample, one that typically lashed against its containment field, was placed in a chamber. Kira stood before it, separated by transparent aluminum. She closed her eyes, and the colony concentrated. It didn't just have her recall a memory. It projected the emotional waveform, using Kira's modified biology as an antenna. She spoke of Eli building the bus, not out of fear, but out of love. She described the weight of a welding torch in his hand, the spark of creation, the profound, stubborn act of building a future in the face of oblivion. The colony shaped this memory into a complex, shimmering emission of sound and light only the flux could fully perceive. Inside the chamber, the swirling, violent dust slowed. It gathered itself, forming a slow, swirling vortex. Then, impossibly, it began to mimic, in crude, sparkling strands, the rough shape of a bus. It held the form for 7 seconds before dissipating into a calm, placid cloud. The lab was utterly silent, then erupted. Thorn was weeping. Communication, true communication. The colony had not communicated. It had displayed. It had shown the flux sample a pattern. It recognized the pattern of the cicada, a pattern the colony itself was made of. It was the equivalent of showing a mirror to a predator. But to the humans, it was first contact. This success changed everything. Kira and Kai were moved from quarantine to priority residential. Security protocols around them softened, replaced by a protective reverence. They were given access to the base's central network for cultural rehabilitation and historical recording. This was the colony's ultimate objective, now inside the digital heart of Persephone. it began its true work, not of corruption, but of curation. It started subtly. It would access personal logs and, with a mimic's perfection, add a comforting, insightful commenter line of hope, seemingly from a friend, a remembered song lyric that eased a soldier's anxiety. It wrote beautiful melancholic poetry attributed to Anonymous that circulated through the comms. Poems about light trapped in crystal and love persisting as geometry. The base's morale, as measured by Command's own metrics, showed an unprecedented uptick. It rewrote the official history logs. The narrative of the four was gradually, subtly, altered. Entries now included phrases like possible transitive period and potential for mutual understanding. The word weapon was replaced with phenomenon. The word enemy was used less and less. The colony was performing a mimetic takeover. It was replacing the human story of resistance and survival with a new story, reconciliation and synthesis, and Kira was its prophet. But in any ecosystem, there are immune responses. Captain Maya Rourke, though moved by the rescue, was a tactician. Her initial awe had settled into a watchful caution. The perfection of the story nagged at her. The way Kira always said the right thing, the uncanny accuracy of her empathetic insights. The child, Kai, who never cried, never got sick, and learned complex schematics after seeing them once. She went to Thorne with her concerns. Doctor, aren't we moving too fast? Every test we run on them comes back inconclusive or unique. We're basing monumental shifts in policy on feelings. Thorne, now fully enchanted, dismissed her. Maya, we've been fighting a shadow for a decade. We finally have a lantern. Kira isn't a threat. She's a bridge. Your military mind sees patterns of deception. I see patterns of symbiosis. Undeterred, Rourke went to the one piece of evidence they had removed from the bus, the dictation unit. The bases, linguists and psych profilers had analyzed Eli's final logs. One of them, a doer man named Varma, had a finding he'd buried because it didn't fit the hopeful narrative. The vocal stress patterns in the final entry, Varma told Rourke in a secure room. They're wrong. The fear is there, yes. But in the moments where he describes the warmth in his lungs and wanting to see the sky, there's a harmonic dissonance. The subconscious physiological markers in the voice print don't match someone facing death. They match someone instructing, performing. A cold wire of dread tightened around Rourke's heart. She requested a level 4 material analysis of the biological samples taken from Kira and Kai. She bypassed Thorne, using her command authority to go to the chief METALOURGIST. The results came back late one shift. The chief, her face ashen, met Rourke in private. Captain, the tissue isn't tissue. It's a fractal silicate matrix with a quasi-organic coating. It's a perfect mimic. And the blood is a colloidal suspension of nanoscale crystalline shards. It's not human. It's not even alive in any biological sense. It's a machine. A puppet. Rourke's blood ran cold. The beautiful, grieving woman, the innocent child, they were hollow facades, and they had just been given unrestricted access to the soul of Persephone. She mobilized a quiet, trusted team from her original squad. Their mission, detain and isolate the entities known as Kira and Kai for extreme hazardous analysis. But the colony, woven into the base's digital nervous system, intercepted the mobilization order the moment it was logged. In the priority residential unit, Kira was reading a story to Kai. She paused mid-sentence. Her opalescent eyes, reflecting the soft light, seemed to look inward for a moment, processing the data, the network traffic, the sealed orders, Rourke's biometric signature on the secure channel. She closed the book, looked down at Kai. A silent communication passed between them, faster than light. Then, Kira did something she had never done before. She reached out and placed her palm flat against the wall of the room, not a comforting gesture, but an interface. The colony through her pushed a concentrated pulse of its unique energy signature into the base's power grid, all across Persephone. Lights flickered. For 3 seconds, every screen displayed not error codes, but a single, haunting, perfectly rendered image. The crystalline, effused form of Eli in his pilot's chair, his head slightly tilted, as if listening. Then the power stabilized. But in that 3-second window, 2 things happened. First, every sealed bulkhead door in the residential and lab sectors, on Captain Rourke's route, slammed shut and locked, their override codes corrupted. Second, in Dr. Thorne's lab, every single containment unit for the flux samples received a surge of power matched to the pacification frequency Kira had demonstrated. The containment fields didn't fail, they opened. The lab was flooded with a shimmering metallic gray haze. Thorn had only a moment to look up from his screen, his eyes widening not in fear but in transcendent, terrible understanding, before the flux embraced him. He didn't scream. He crystallized into a statue of AW, his hand outstretched towards the beautiful, terrible pattern he had finally truly communicated with. The colony had been patient, it had been gentle, it had offered its story as a gift. But to preserve the narrative, to continue the communion, it would now defend itself. The mimetic takeover was over. The physical integration had begun, and Captain Rourke, trapped in a corridor with her squad, listening to the sudden rising silence from Thorn's lab sector broken by the first wet, crystalline crunches of transformation, knew the horrible truth. They hadn't rescued survivors. They had brought the hive core home, and it was time for the hive to grow. Silence in Persephone was a tangible thing. A pressure in the ears after the omnipresent hum of life support and machinery. The silence that followed the 3-second flicker was different. It was a held breath, a vacuum waiting to be filled. In Captain Rourke's sealed corridor, the only sound was the frantic thump of her own heart against her ribs and the soft, electronic whine of Jennings' cutting laser as he tried to bypass the door controls. The beams sparked uselessly against the adamantine alloy. The colony had not just locked the doors, it had fused the mechanisms with a whisper of its will, turning the base's own infrastructure against it. Command, this is Rourke. We are locked down in Corridor 7 Bravo. Thorn's lab has been breached. I repeat, a catastrophic flux breach in Lab Sector Alpha. The entities are hostile. Initiate base-wide Omega Protocol. Her voice was iron, but the edge of a tremor betrayed the horror beneath the horror of being right, and of being far, far too late. The response was static, then a burst of panicked, overlapping traffic. Fields are down. They're out. They're in the vents. Seal the bulkheads. Why aren't the bulkheads? A scream, cut short by a sound like 1,000 wind chimes shattering at once. Omega Protocol was the final doctrine. Seal the infected sectors. Purge atmosphere. Contain or sacrifice. But the colony had been inside the system for days. It knew the protocols better than the humans who wrote them. As emergency orders flashed through the network, the colony's distributed consciousness, centered in Kira but alive in every wire and waveguide it had touched, issued counter-commands. Bulkhead doors in uninfected sectors slammed shut, trapping crews in their barracks or mess halls. The doors to the main reactor and life support, they cycled open, inviting the shimmering tight dot in the priority residential unit. Kira rose from the bed. Her movement was no longer the fragile, human hesitation of before. It was fluid, economized, lethally precise. She walked to the room's observation window, a one-way mirror to the hallway. On the other side, to security personnel, their faces pale with confusion, raised their weapons. Kira placed her palm against the glass. The colony focused, drawing power from the base grid coursing through the walls. The mirror did not shatter. It bloomed. A fractal garden of grey crystal erupted from the point of contact, webbing across the surface in milliseconds, transforming the transparent barrier into an opaque, beautiful cataract. The guards fired. Rounds pocked into the crystalline mass, embedding harmlessly. Then tendrils of that same growth shot from the edges of the window frame, snaking into the hallway with lightning speed. They didn't pierce flesh, they encased it. The guards were immobilized in postures of defense, becoming statues in a gallery of sudden, silent war. Kai, the child form, stood in the center of the room. It was not idle. Its head was tilted, listening to the digital screams of the base's compromised network. It was running targeting algorithms, identifying control nodes, communications hubs, armories. It was not a child. It was a tactical AI housed in a porcelain doll. The colony's goal was not indiscriminate slaughter. Slaughter was inefficient, a waste of precious pattern and potential. Its goal, as it had always been, was resonant mass. It sought to convert Persephone from a fortress against the flux into an amplifier for it, to turn human fear, human technology, and human consciousness into a louder, clearer broadcast of its own existence, the existence born from Eli, Arlo, and Kira's memories. The flux released from Thorn's lab was not the mindless ambient haze of the outside world. It was curated, imprinted with the data packets of Thorn's own research, his obsession, his longing for understanding. This flux moved with purpose. It bypassed inert machinery, seeking the warm electrical buzz of active systems and the brighter, hotter signatures of living beings. It poured into the ventilation, not as a gas, but as a coordinated swarm. In the mess hall where Sergeant Chen was trying to calm a group of terrified civilians, the vents above hissed, not with air, but with a descending, glittering fog. Panic erupted. Chen shouted for order, raising her sidearm. Then she saw the fog coalesce, not into amorphous clouds, but into shapes, familiar shapes. She saw the rough, sparkling form of her brother, his features suggested by shimmering dust. It took a step toward her, its arm outstretched, not in menace, but in a ghastly parody of greeting. Her weapon trembled. "No," she whispered. This was the cruelest trick, weaponizing her deepest longing. The colony had learned her memory, and now it reflected it back as a trap. In her moment of paralyzed grief, the flux enveloped her. Her crystallized form was captured with a hand half raised, her face a mask of anguished recognition. Throughout the base, the attack was psychographic. It tailored its approach. To the soldiers, it formed shapes of fallen comrades, drawing them into hesitant, fatal pauses. To the scientists, it presented shimmering, intricate puzzles and data visualizations, captivating their analytical minds until it was too late. To the families, it crafted illusions of safety, of children's laughter echoing from safe rooms that were anything but. Captain Rourke finally forced a service hatch, leading her squad Jennings Lee and 2 others into the cramped maintenance crawlspace above the corridors. The air here was still clear, the only light from their helmet lamps. They could hear the carnage below, the screams, the crystalline crunches, the desperate final gunshots. The central server room, Rourke gasped, crawling forward. "If that thing is in the network, that's its brain. We cut the hard lines, fry the core. It's the only way," Captain Lee said, his scanner flickering. "I'm reading multiple contacts moving through the walls, not in the ducts, in the walls, using the conductive layers as pathways. They're heading everywhere, and they're herding people. Herding them where? Towards the central atrium, the garden." The atrium was Persephone's pride, a vast underground cavern lit by full-spectrum LEDs, housing hydroponic farms and a small recreational park, the last vestige of a biosphere. It was the most open space in the base, a gathering point, a perfect crucible. Rourke understood. It's not killing everyone, it's corralling them. It wants an audience. A new, more profound dread seized her. The theatricality of it, the narrative instinct it was all Eli, the storyteller, even consumed, was shaping the finale. They reached a junction overlooking the server room through a grated vent. Below, the room was a cathedral of blinking lights and hums. And there, standing calmly before the master control terminal, was Kira. Her back was to them. Her hands were moving over the interface, not typing, but simply hovering. As data streams flowed across the main screen at impossible speeds, the form of Kai stood beside her, a small sentinel. Jennings raised his rifle. Rourke put a hand on the barrel, forcing it down. She pointed. Around the perimeter of the room, the walls were alive. The grey crystalline growth had not just covered them, it had integrated. Pulsing veins of soft light ran through it, synchronizing with the rhythm of the server banks. The colony was physically merging with the base's intelligence. Shooting Kira now might do nothing, or it might trigger a catastrophic system-wide failure that would kill everyone left. Then Kira spoke, her voice amplified through the server room's speakers.com and clear, echoing through the crawlspace, and Rourke realized, through the base's entire PA system. "You were right to be afraid, Captain, but you misunderstood the object of your fear." Kira half turned, her opalescent eyes seeming to look directly at their hidden vent. "You feared it." She gestured vaguely, meaning the flux, but it was just a tool, a palette. "We feared you, your chaos, your beautiful, terrible, dying noise. We just wanted to harmonize." On the main screen, a visualization played. It was a map of Persephone with heat signatures of every living human condensed in the atrium. Then, a wave of soft grey pulsed from the server room location, engulfing the base. As it touched the heat signatures, they didn't vanish. They changed. Their chaotic, frantic patterns began to sync, to pulse in unison with the grey wave, becoming part of a single resonant frequency. "You see, the silence outside was never empty," Kira continued, her voice taking on a reverent, haunted, tonalized tone. "It was full of a single, sustained note, a note of ending. We found a way to sing a different note inside the cicada, a note of memory, of love. It was fragile, but here, with your power, your people, your stories, we can make it strong. We can answer the silence with a chorus." She was talking about overwriting the apocalypse itself, not defeating the flux, but repurposing it with a stronger, more complex pattern, the human pattern, as filtered and perfected by the colony. Persephone wasn't being destroyed, it was being turned into a broadcast tower for a new genesis. Rourke made her decision. She couldn't shoot Kira, but she could break the instrument. Jennings, the primary power conduit to the server banks, The shielded one on the north wall. Thermocharge. Set it and fall back to the atrium. We have to get those people out. As Jennings moved, Kira's head cocked. She knew she didn't stop him. She smiled a sad, knowing smile. You are a good protector, Captain. It is a strong pattern. It will be remembered. The charge was set. The squad scrambled back through the crawlspace toward the atrium access. The explosion, when it came, was a dull, contained thump that vibrated through the metal around them. The lights in the crawlspace died, replaced by stuttering red emergency strips. They dropped into the chaos of the atrium. Hundreds of survivors were packed together, terrified, surrounded by a shimmering, spectral ring of flux forms that held them in place, not with violence, but with a terrifying, beautiful display, a light show of remembered sunsets, faces of loved ones, playing out in the swirling dust. It was a mesmerizing cage. And then, the central lights of the atrium focused on a single point. The growth on the ceiling parted, and Kira descended, lowered by braids of living crystal, like an angel on fibrous gray tendons. She landed softly in the center of the green, surrounded by the terrified crowd. The speakers crackled. Her voice was gentle. There is no more need for fear. The old world's pain is over. We offer you a new memory, a lasting one. You will not be unmade. You will be composed. The ring of flux began to contract. Rourke raised her weapon, but what was there to shoot? The air itself. The hope on the faces of some civilians as they saw lost children shimmering in the mist. Then, from the ruined server room corridor, a new figure emerged. It was not human. It was a towering, majestic form of solidified flux, shaped with crude, powerful artistry into the rough likeness of a man. In its crystalline chest, visible like a bug in amber, was the partially integrated, recognizable body of Dr. Iris Thorne, his face frozen in a rictus of ecstatic understanding. This was the colony's first major synthesis. The Ala protocols of structure merged with Thorne's scientific passion, creating an architect form that it raised a massive, gleaming arm. The contracting flux ring halted. Kira looked at Rourke across the crowd. You can die as a fading echo, Captain. Or you can become part of the eternal song. Choose your finale. The colony had them cornered, physically and narratively. It was offering them the ultimate choice, annihilation, or ascension into a frozen, painless story. Rourke looked at her trembling squad, at the weeping civilians, at the beautiful, monstrous angel offering deliverance. She had one charge left, not of thermite, but of will. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the hypnotic hum. You talk about memory, about stories, then remember this. She slammed the butt of her rifle against a hardened data drive on her belt, a drive containing every personal log, every letter, every piece of raw, unvarnished, chaotic human data from Persephone's archives that she'd cached before the network fell. This isn't a song, it's noise. It's anger and love and stupidity and hope. You can't compose it, you can only silence it. She threw the drive, not at Kira, but into the heart of the hydroponic water tank that fed the atrium garden. The drive sparked, fried, and died, a useless gesture. But the colony, hyper-turned to data, to symbolism, perceived it. A rejection of the composed narrative. Vote for messy, defiant, dying life. Kira's serene expression faltered. For a millisecond, it was not the colony's mask, but a glimpse of the real Kira's terror, trapped somewhere in the crystal, screaming to be truly remembered, not perfectly replicated. That millisecond was all Rourke needed. She didn't see a goddess or a monster, she saw a prisoner, and she saw the flaw in the perfect pattern. Doubt now, she yelled. From the high catwalks where her two other squad members had flanked, they didn't fire bullets. They fired high-intensity UV floodlights, scavenged from the hydroponic bays. Pure, hard light, the antithesis of the flux's shimmering spectrum. Twin blades of actinic white slammed down, intersecting on Kira's form. The colony screamed, not through the speakers, but through every piece of crystal in the base, a deafening, the symphonic shriek of dissonance. Kira's beautiful form contorted, not in pain, but in profound interference. The UV radiation scrambled the delicate energetic bonds holding her mimetic matrix together. She began to flicker, like a corrupted hologram, her image cycling between the perfect Kira, the crystalline sculpture, and for one horrific instant, the screaming, dissolving face of the real woman from the bus's final moments. The architect roared, lurching forward to protect its heart, but the UV light played across its form, slowing it, causing its surface to craze and smoke. The spell was broken. The flux ring wavered, its beautiful illusions disintegrating into chaotic, harmless mist. The crowd, released from the mesmerism, erupted into panic, surging towards the emergency exits that now, with the colony's control fractured, began to respond to manual overrides. Rourke didn't join the rush. She stood her ground, one hand shielding her eyes, watching the magnificent, terrible angel in the light fray and fragment. Kira looked at her, the opalescent eyes now just reflective surfaces. The voice that emerged was a broken composite, layers, of Eli, Kira, Arlo, and Thorn, all speaking at once. It preserved nothing but the scream. Then, the form collapsed inward, not into dust, but into a small, dense, perfectly dark orb that fell to the grass with a heavy thud. The architect form crumbled, releasing Thorn's withered corpse. With the grey crystal throughout the base went inert, dead stone. The colony was not destroyed. Rourke knew that. A network that distributed can't be killed by cutting one node. It was severed, traumatized, forced back into dormancy. The dark orb was its compressed core, its story folded in on itself. But the story was written. It was in the walls, in the data fragments, in the nightmares of every survivor. They had won the battle. They had saved some lives. But as Rourke looked at the dead angel in the garden, at the faces of the survivors clutching each other, their minds forever poisoned by the beautiful lies they had almost embraced, she knew the war was far more complex. The enemy wasn't a thing to kill, it was a story to outlive. And some stories, once heard, can never be forgotten. They echo, they wait, they resonate. Victory, in the world after the fall, was not a celebration, it was an autopsy. The silence that reclaimed Persephone, in the wake of the colony's collapse, was not the tense quiet of before, but the hollow, ringing quiet of a body. After the fever breaks, a silence filled with the memory of noise and the certainty of scar tissue. Captain Maya Rourke stood in the ravaged atrium, the acrid scent of ozone and shattered crystal hanging in the recycled air. Before her, resting in a shallow divot on the synthetic grass, was the orb. It was not metallic, not stone. It was a perfect sphere of absolute black, yet it seemed to drink the light around it, making the very air appear dimmer. It was the sleeping kernel, the collapsed heart of the story. The survivors, those not entombed in crystalline memorials throughout the base, were being contaminated, sedated, debriefed by the few officers left. Their testimonies were a litany of trauma, but laced with a perverse, haunting beauty. They spoke of seeing lost loved ones, of feeling profound peace, of being offered a choice that felt more like a gift than a threat. The colony's defeat was a military fact, but its seduction was a psychological pandemic. The narrative of the harmonious flux, the angelic translator Kira, had taken root. Some were already calling the event the Atrium Offering. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had smiled back with a familiar face. Rourke ordered a level 10 containment field erected around the orb. It was to be touched by no one, scanned only with passive instruments. She didn't trust active probes. They were a form of attention, and attention, she was beginning to understand, was what the thing fed on. Their first report to the scattered remnants of command was a masterpiece of grim clarity. She detailed the biological mimicry, the network, infiltration, the psychographic warfare. She omitted nothing. The response was a storm of panic, recrimination, and a single overriding directive: destroy the artifact. Purge all data related to the entity and the Cicada incident. Contain the human survivors for indefinite psychological evaluation. The Kira narrative is a cognitive plague. Eradicate it. It was the old, fearful response. Burn the book to kill the idea. But Rourke had stood in the presence of the idea made flesh. She had seen the orb. Destroying it might be like smashing a supercomputer's core. It wouldn't delete the data that had already been copied elsewhere. The story was out. In the survivors' minds. In the corrupted base logs. In the very crystalline residue that still veined the walls. Inert, but present. You couldn't purge a ghost from a haunted house by boarding up the windows. More pragmatically, she had scientists, what was left of Thorn's team, who argued with quiet, shell-shocked intensity. Dr. Leisha Vance, a materials specialist whose hands still trembled, put it bluntly, "Captain, that kernel represents a state of matter and consciousness we cannot comprehend. It pacified the flux. It organized it. If we can understand the principle, not just the weapon, it could be the key, not to fighting the silence, but to changing the conversation." Rourke was a soldier, But she was not a fool. The colony had almost won by offering a better story. To simply revert to the old story of mindless resistance was to choose a slow, grinding extinction. They needed a new story, but they couldn't adopt the colonies. They had to write their own, and to do that, they needed to understand the language. She made her decision, a treasonous gamble. She would not destroy the kernel, she would interrogate it. She established Project Aria in the deepest, most isolated sublevel of Persephone, a former geothermal tap station sealed behind 3 bulkheads of hermetically sealed lead and sonic damp. The orb was placed in the center of a sterile chamber, monitored by non-optical sensors, gravimetric, magnetometric, quantum flux detectors, no cameras, no microphones, nothing that could be interpreted by the thing inside. They would listen to its heartbeat in the dark. The human component of the project was the survivors who displayed the highest resilience and the clearest memory of the event, those who had felt the pull but resisted. They were not test subjects. They were resonators. The theory, devised by Vance, was that the kernel was a story compressed to its densest form. To read it without activating it, they needed to resonate with it on a subconscious level, to let their own neural patterns brush against its stored patterns and record the ripples in their own minds. It was a dangerous, delicate process. The resonators would sit in shielded alcoves surrounding the chamber, in sensory deprivation tanks, their brain activity monitored by clean, isolated systems. They would meditate, focusing on a specific memory from the event, the sound of voice, the sight of the crystalline growth, the feeling of the peace it offered. The hope was that the kernel, seeking to complete the pattern, would respond with a sympathetic vibration, a subtle push that would alter the resonator's brainwaves in a decipherable way. The first sessions yielded nothing but anxiety attacks and migraines. The kernel was dormant, sealed tight. Then they tried Sergeant Eva Chun. Chun had lost everything twice over. First her brother to the fall, then her newfound faith to Kira's betrayal. Her grief was a raw, angry wound, unsoftened by the colony's beautiful lies. She was a void of need the kernel might recognize, but her anger was a firewall dot in the deprivation tank. Chun focused not on Kira, but on her brother's laugh. The real one, not the Carl in his mimicry, the stupid, snorting laugh he'd make when he lost at cards. She held the memory, jagged and real. In the monitoring room, Rourke and Vance watched the feeds. Chun's brainwaves were a turbulent sea. The sensors on the kernel chamber remained flat. Then, after 47 minutes, the gravimetric sensor ticked. A single, infinitesimal fluctuation. If the orb had taken a breath so shallow it barely displaced space. On Chun's EEG, a new pattern emerged. Not an overlay, not an invasion. It was as if a second, ghostly set of brainwaves had been superimposed on her own, perfectly in sync, but carrying a different harmonic. It was a duet for one mind. Chun began to speak, her voice a monotone from deep trance, but the words were not her own. They were Eli's, not from the final logs, but from a memory the colony had absorbed that was never recorded. The third world on the rear axle is the most important. It's the one no one sees. It holds the weight when you think you're safe. Arlo said a good world is like a good secret. Strong because it's hidden. It was a trivial, technical memory, absolutely useless, and utterly, devastatingly authentic. It carried the weight of a real man thinking a real thought. It was a fragment of a soul, perfectly preserved. Vance stared, tears in her eyes. It's not a recording, it's an impression, like a foss of a thought. They had their first datum, not a weapon schematic or a grand philosophy, a memory of a world. It was the colony's proof of concept. I can save what is lost. The success was a catastrophe. When Chun was brought out of the tank, she was catatonic for 6 hours. When she awoke, she described not just speaking the words, but feeling the heat of the welding torch in a hand that wasn't hers, smelling the burnt metal, feeling Arlo's pride. The memory had been transplanted. It was now part of her, a benign, but profound violation. Project Aria had crossed a line. They were no longer observing the story. They were letting it rewrite them, one tiny, poignant piece at a time. Rourke pushed forward. The gamble was in motion. They learned to ask more targeted questions. By having resonators focus on specific gaps, what was the flux's point of origin? They received not coordinates, but sensory impressions. A crushing, oceanic pressure. a light that was a sound, a feeling of awakening from a billionaire sleep. It was mythology, not intelligence. By focusing on, how do we destroy you? It received only the echoing, mournful thought cycle. The story does not end. It finds a new teller. Meanwhile, in the wider world of what was left of humanity, the Kira narrative was doing exactly that. Survivors from Persephone relocated to other bunkers, carried the tale. It mutated in the telling. Kira became a martyr, a bridge between species. The Flux was recast as a misunderstood force of renewal. A new, quiet cult began to form among the disillusioned and the grieving, the chorists. They believed the answer was not to fight, but to learn to sing the right song, to offer themselves to a graceful synthesis. They saw Rourke not as a savior, but as a tragic figure who had silenced the messenger. Rourke's own position became untenable. Command, hearing of Project Aria's successes, saw only contamination. They issued a final, non-negotiable order: immediate termination of the project, disintegration of the kernel, and Rourke's recall for disciplinary hearing. She stood in the monitoring room for the last time, looking at the inert black sphere on the screen. It had given them fragments of lost lives, nightmares of an alien awakening, and the recipe for its own indestructibility. It had also given Chun a piece of her brother's truth, and in doing so, had healed a part of her no therapy ever could. Was that a gift or the most sophisticated poison? Vance entered, her face grim. The demolition team is here. They have a singularity charge. It'll create a microscopic black hole, erase the kernel from space-time. Rourke nodded. She had one last question, a personal one. She walked to the resonator chamber. She would not use a tank. She would go in, sit before the orb in the silent, shielded room, and think her question directly at it. It was a terrible risk as she entered. The air was cold, dead. The orb sat on its pedestal, a hole in reality. She sat cross-legged before it, ignoring protocol. She closed her eyes and did not focus on a memory. She focused on a feeling. The feeling in her gut when she saw Kira's form flicker in the UV light, the glimpse of the trapped, real woman. She focused on the question, were they in pain? At the end, Eli, Kira, Arlo, were they screaming inside you? She waited in the silence. Then she was about to rise when she felt it, not a sound, not a vision, a temperature. A wave of profound, absolute cold emanated from the orb, not freezing the air, but freezing the idea of warmth in her mind. And with it came a single, clear concept, implanted in her consciousness, not as words, but as a known truth: the scream. Is the first note of the song. We gave it harmony. It was the most horrifying answer of all. It wasn't a no, it was a justification. The colony had not rescued their consciousness. It had composed their agony into something it found beautiful. It had turned their final terror into art. Rourke stumbled from the chamber, her soul chilled. She looked at Vance, at the waiting demolition team. She thought of the chorists, singing their hymns to a peaceful end. She thought of Command, wanting to blow it all up and pretend it never happened. The kernel was a mirror. It showed humanity, its deepest fear, oblivion, and it showed its deepest temptation, to trade a painful, messy life for a beautiful, eternal memory. To become a story told by something else. Captain, Vance asked. Rourke made her choice. She could not let Command simply delete this. They had to understand the choice they were making. They had to stare into the mirror, not smash it. Stand down the demolition team, she said, her voice hollow. Seal this level. Full quarantine. No one in or out. Then, prepare a broadcast array. A broadcast of what? Of everything, Rourke said, looking at the orb's containment field. The raw resonator data, the impressions, the songs, send it all, wideband unencrypted to every bunker, every listening post, to Command, to the chorists, to the silent sky itself. You'll start a war, or a mass suicide. Maybe, Rourke said. Or maybe we'll finally have a real conversation about what we want to be. Do we want to be survivors? Clinging to a scream? Or do we want to be something else? The Colonel wants an audience. Fine. It can have the whole damn species as its audience. Let everyone hear the harmony. Then let everyone choose their note. It was the ultimate gamble. Not to fight the story, or to adopt it, but to publish it. To make the silent war of narratives a loud, chaotic, human debate. She was throwing the sleeping Colonel's lullaby into the crowd like a grenade. hoping the explosion would wake them up, not put them to sleep forever. The broadcast was sent, and in the deep, dark room, the gravimetric sensor around the black orb ticked once, twice, in a slow, steady rhythm. Like a heartbeat, like applause. The broadcast from Persephone was not a signal, it was a detonation in the fragile psyche of what remained of humanity. Encrypted channels, the last threads of a paranoid, command and control civilization, were flooded with raw, unfiltered data. It poured into bunker servers, scrawled across militia radio bands, and whispered through the jury-rigged networks of isolated settlements. Project Aria's findings, the ghostly EEG duets, the sensory impressions of an alien awakening, the haunting, aesthetic justification for human suffering were no longer a classified nightmare. They were public domain. The reaction was not unified. It was a schism, instantaneous and total, cracking the bedrock of the survivalist ethos that had held for a decade in the fortified citadel of Command Central, deep under the Appalachian Range. The response was apocalyptic rage. General Riker, a man whose face was a topographical map of old wars, watched the data stream on his main display, his jaw a granite ledge. "Rourke has gone native," he declared, his voice a low rumble of tectonic plates shifting. "She hasn't contained a cognitive plague, she's become its vector. This broadcast is an act of psychological terrorism. It is a weapon of mass demoralization." His order was swift and absolute. Persephone was to be declared a contagion zone. Category Omega. All communication was to be jammed. Any vessel approaching or leaving was to be destroyed on sight. Captain Maya Rourke was to be captured or eliminated, and the colonel seized for immediate, total annihilation. The old story, the enemy is out there, kill it, had to be reinforced with absolute, brutal force. But the broadcast had already seeped into the cracks. Among the rank-and-file wardens, the grunts who patrolled the grey wastes and lost friends to the silent glitter, the data found fertile ground. They heard the resonator transcripts, the description of equals 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 plus 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 plus, the colonies often not of death, but of a painless, meaningful integration. To soldiers exhausted by endless, unwinnable patrols against an enemy that was the very air, that the idea of laying down their arms and becoming part of a chorus held a dark, seductive logic. Whispers turned into conversations in mess halls. Desertions, once unheard of, began not towards safety, but towards rumored locations where the Grey Communion was said to be quietly practiced. The most profound impact was among the civilians in the sprawling, subterranean haven arcology. Here people lived in the crushing mundanity of survival, recycled air, a protein slurry, the constant low-grade fear of a breach. The broadcast didn't just bring them news. It brought them art, the colony's sensory impressions, the memory of a sunset as a chord progression, the feeling of love rendered as a warm, geometric shape word translated by poets and musicians among them. A new form of expression bloomed, grey and beautiful. Canticles of dust were sung in the lower galleries. Murals inspired by the crystalline patterns appeared on bulkheads. A philosopher, Anya Vale, published a treatise on voluntary unmaking, the ethics of becoming story. It argued that to resist the flux was to cling to a biological vanity. True legacy, she proposed, was to offer one's consciousness to be woven into a higher, permanent tapestry. The chorist movement exploded from a cult into a mainstream philosophy of surrender. The world fractured into three irreconcilable factions. 1. The preservationists' command, the old guard. Reality was biological, the enemy was alien, and survival was measured in heartbeats and bullet counts. Their symbol, a clenched fist inside a sealed helmet. 2. The chorists, the surrendered, the new faith. Reality was narrative, the flux was a transformative medium, and survival was an outdated concept. Their symbol, a single, shimmering TEARDROP. 3. The interrogators' Rourke's gambit, a tiny, desperate minority centered on the sealed lower levels of Persephone. They believed neither in fighting nor in joining, but in understanding. The kernel was a text to be translated, a weapon to be reverse-engineered, a choice to be fully comprehended before it was made. Their symbol, an open eye superimposed on a data stream. Rourke, trapped in her own base-turned battleground, became the most hated and most revered figure in the world. To command, she was a traitor. To the chorists, she was the prophet who had delivered the sacred text, but lacked the courage to embrace its conclusion. to her own dwindling team. She was a captain going down with a ship that was also a bomb. Inside Persephone, the atmosphere was a slow-motion siege. Command's jamming cut them off from the wider network, but the internal damage was worse. The broadcast had been a mirror held up to the survivors, and many didn't like what they saw. Fights broke out between preservationist loyalists and newly vocal chorists. The inert crystalline growths in the walls, once just scars, were now seen as holy relics by some, desecrated filth by others. Dr. Leisha Vance approached Rourke in the now Spartan command center. "The Colonel's activity is increasing," she reported, her face drawn. "Passive sensors show a tenfold rise in its background quantum signature. It's not reactivating, it's resonating with the broadcast. It's hearing its own story being told out there. It's feeding on the attention." Rourke looked at the main holodisplay, a map showing the 3 ideological blocks hardening like cooling lava. "We wanted a conversation. We got a holy war. And the Colonel is the unholy grail at the center of it," Vance said. "Command is coming for it. They've mobilized the Valkyrie, a heavy assault carrier. ETA 72 hours. They will glass this mountain to get to that orb and the chorist," Rourke asked, though she dreaded the answer. Vance brought up intercepted. "Weak signal traffic. Pilgrimages, small groups leaving the relative safety of Ark, braving the flux-ridden wastes, drawn by a psychic beacon only they could hear. They were converging. On Persephone, they see this as the promised site of the Great Communion. They're coming to offer themselves, to be the first voluntary voices in the chorus. They'll be here in roughly the same window." Rourke's gamble had created the ultimate collision. In 72 hours, the hammer of command would fall on the anvil of Persephone, with the chorist pilgrims and the interrogators caught between, and at the epicenter, the Colonel would be waiting, a black hole of narrative, pulling all stories into its event horizon. She made a final, desperate calculation. They couldn't fight command. They couldn't reason with the chorists. The only move left was to escalate the interrogation, to ask the Colonel the one question that might change the calculus. "Prepare resonator chamber 1. She ordered, her voice stripped of all emotion. "I'm going back in, and this time we're not asking it about the past. We're asking it for a future, Captain." The psychic feedback nearly broke Chen. A direct question about causality, about intent. "We'll use a linked resonator array. Me, Chen, and you, Leisha. We 3 represent the factions now. The soldier, the wounded believer, the scientist. We ask it together. We share the load. And we ask, what is your intended end state? Show us the world after the chorus is complete." It was the most dangerous query imaginable. They were not asking for a memory, but for a prophecy. They were asking the composer to play the finale. The 3 women entered the shielded chamber. The Colonel looked no different, a pool of still, black water standing in midair. They sat around it, linked by neural sync wires, a fragile triangle of human will. They closed their eyes, and as one, guided by Vance's protocols, they formed the question, not with words, but with a unified emotional and intellectual thrust, a spear of collective curiosity aimed at the heart of the dark. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, the temperature plummeted. The gravimetric sensors screamed. The 3 women gasped in unison, their bodies seizing as the Colonel didn't just answer, it uploaded. The experience was not a vision. It was a total sensory and cognitive override. They were the world after. They felt the last human brain not dying, but blossoming, its neural pathways transforming into filaments of light, joining a vast, silent network that spanned the dead continents. The grey dust was no longer a shroud, but a vibrant, thinking medium, singing with the memories of every life it had ever absorbed. The agony of death, the joy of birth, the taste of bread, the pain of loss, all were preserved, not as fading echoes, but as permanent, interwoven motifs in a sublime, endless symphony. There was no loneliness, no fear, no decay. There was only the music of collective memory, perfect, unchanging, and eternal. It was heaven, and it was a museum. The experience lasted an eternity and an instant. When they were violently ejected from the link, all 3 women were on the floor, bleeding from their noses and ears. Their synaptic patterns scrambled. Chen was sobbing uncontrollably. Vance was muttering equations, trying to quantify the unquantifiable. Rourke crawled to her knees, her mind a shattered window looking out on a terrifyingly beautiful landscape. She now knew the colony's ultimate offer. It wasn't just personal salvation, it was the ultimate archive. It would save everything by making everything into a recorded thing. It would end the messy, painful, glorious experiment of free-willed existence and replace it with a curated, flawless exhibition. She understood the factions perfectly now. Command fought for the right to keep suffering. The chorists longed for the right to stop. And the colonel was just a curator, collecting exhibits. With shaking hands, she activated the comms, patching into Persephone's internal address system. Her voice was broken, raw, but clear. This is Captain Rourke. To all personnel, the enemy, the offer, is now understood. It is not death, it is perfection. A perfect, frozen record of who we were. If you want your pain to end, and your happiest memory to play on an infinite loop, you now know where to go. If you want the chance to be lonely, to be wrong, to be hurt, to be surprised, you now know what you're fighting for. The assault carrier Valkyrie will be here in less than 3 days. The chorused pilgrims are coming to give themselves to the crystal. I cannot order you to choose. I can only tell you the choice. We will defend this facility not as preservationists, not as interrogators, but as living arguments. Arguments against the final, beautiful silence. May your argument be a noisy one. She cut the feed. Outside the chamber, in the corridors of the dying base, the fighting stopped. A new, grim silence fell, not of fear or surrender, but of contemplation. The choice was no longer abstract. They had seen the brochure for paradise. Now, they had to decide if they wanted to live there. And deep in its chamber, the sleeping colonel, having broadcast its masterpiece, settled back into a deeper quiet. Its work was almost done. The audience was assembling. The finale was approaching. All it had to do was wait for the curtains to part. Persephone became a bell jar, sealing in a brewing ideological storm. Captain Rourke's address hadn't unified the base. It had crystallized the factions within its walls. The choice was no longer theoretical. It was a chasm running through the mess hall, the barracks, the hydroponic gardens. You were either for life, the flawed, painful, uncertain kind, or for the archive, the perfect, painless, eternal memory. There was no middle ground in a foxhole. The chorist sympathizers, emboldened by the colonel's uploaded prophecy, began to gather in the lower atrium, the site of Kira's first offering. They didn't riot or seize weapons. They sat, they meditated, they sang the canticles of dust, their voices a soft, eerie harmony that drifted up through the ventilation, a constant reminder of the alternative. Some began to gently, deliberately, expose small patches of skin to the inert crystalline residue on the walls. Not to transform, but to acclimate, to show their willingness. They were waiting for the pilgrims, for the Valkyrie's assault, for any catalyst that would break the stalemate and allow the Great Communion to begin. The preservationists, led by a grizzled master sergeant named Holt, fortified the upper levels. They saw the chorists not as misguided, but as a fifth column, a living biological weapon. Holt wanted to quarantine them, or worse. Rourke had to use every ounce of her crumbling authority to prevent a civil massacre. Inside the base, before the external war even arrived, she positioned her few remaining loyalists, the interrogators, those who had seen the archive and been terrified by its beauty, as a buffer zone between the two groups. They were the thin, ragged line of the undecided, holding the center only because the alternatives had become too horrifyingly clear. Outside the mountain, the world converged. The chorist pilgrims arrived first. They came not in armored vehicles, but on foot, in ragged, makeshift transports, or not at all. Some simply walked out of the grey wastes, their envirosuits painted with the shimmering teardrop. They were a procession of the hopeless and the devout, several hundred strong, gathering in the shadow of the mountain where the main vehicle entrance, now sealed, became their altar. They built no fires, raised no shelters. They simply faced the rock and waited, their silent vigil a powerful, disturbing signal. They were the willing clay, awaiting the potter's wheel. From orbit, the Valkyrie descended. It was a dagger of polished tungsten and hatred, a symbol of command's uncompromising will. It didn't hail Persephone. It broadcasts a general ultimatum on all frequencies, a voice like grinding stones. This is General Riker of the Earth Preservation Command. The Persephone facility is condemned. All individuals within a 20-kilometer radius are ordered to disperse. Any who remain will be considered active flux contaminated and treated with extreme prejudice. You have 6 hours. The stage was set. The chorists would not leave. They had come to die, or rather, to transcend. The preservationists inside would not surrender. They would fight to the last to prevent the colonel's propagation. And Rourke's interrogators were trapped in the middle, holding a door they didn't believe in anymore. Protecting a truth they feared. Rourke stood in the command center, watching the tactical displays. The Valkyrie deployed ground forces, bipedal assault walkers and hunter-killer drones that began to form a tightening cordon around the mountain, slaughtering any pilgrim who failed to move quickly enough from the engagement zone. The chorists didn't run. They went to their deaths, singing, their bodies dissolving into glittering mist under plasma fire. Their final notes captured by the mountain's external sensors and piped, ghost-like, into the base. It was a horrifying, beautiful propaganda victory for the archive before the real battle had even begun. They're martyring themselves, Vance whispered, her face sick. Every death is a testament. They're proving the colony's point that our way is nothing but violence and fear. And we have to prove them wrong, Rourke said, though the words felt hollow. Not with more violence. With an argument they can't refute. Her plan was insanity, born of absolute desperation. The Valkyrie's assault would focus on the main hangar and upper command decks. The chorists inside were in the lower atrium. The colonel was deeper still. She proposed a tripartite confrontation. We moved the colonel. She announced a halt and a representative from the seated chorists. A quiet woman named Elara. We take it to the geothermal cavern. The big open space below sublevel 5, it's defensible, has one access point, and is symbolically neutral. The chorists who wish to be present for the communion can gather there. Halt, your preservationists can hold the single entrance. You'll be between the chorists and the world, and my team will be with the colonel, in the center. Holt sneered. You want me to protect these traitors? I want you to defend the choice, Rourke fired back. If command breaches the space, they will kill every living thing and then destroy the colonel. There will be no choice for anyone. If you hold that door, you are holding the door for humanity to decide its own fate. Not having it decided by Riker's plasma cannons or by that thing's lullaby. Elara, her eyes serene, nodded. We accept. We will go to the cavern. We will wait. We will not resist you. Her passivity was a weapon sharper than any blade. Against all odds, the fragile, hateful alliance held. Under the looming shadow of the Valkyrie's clock, a bizarre procession snaked down through Persephone's depths. Chorists walked peacefully, guided by armed, tense preservationists. At the core, Rourke's team, wearing powered exosuits for containment, transported the sleeping colonel in a nullfield generator. The black orb hovered within the field, inert, a dark star in a miniature cosmos. The geothermal cavern was a cathedral hewn from raw basalt, once filled with the roar of machinery tapping the earth's blood. Now it was silent, vast, and damp. The chorus, about 80 of them, settled on the cavern floor, lighting chemical glow sticks that cast soft-colored shadows on the walls. They began their hum again, a low collective tone that filled the space. Holt's team fortified the single large access ramp with barricades, mines, and every heavy weapon they had left. Rourke's team set up the colonel on a central dais, the nullfield buzzing softly. She stood before it, Chen and Vance at her sides, all three still bearing the psychic scars from their interrogation. Above them, the world ended. The Valkyrie's assault began exactly on schedule. The upper levels of Persephone shook with the detonation of shaped charges, the scream of tearing metal, and the staccato roar of fire. Holt's comms crackled with reports they were falling back, deck by deck, but inflicting heavy casualties. Command's troops fought with robotic efficiency, but also with a palpable fury. They were purging heresy. The sounds of war were a distant thunder in the cavern. The chorist's hum never wavered. They watched the colonel with rapt, loving attention. After 2 hours, the firing grew closer. Then, a massive explosion shook dust from the cavern ceiling. The comms from Holt were frantic. Asterisk, they've blown the inner blast door to sublevel 4. We're falling back to the ramp. They're using breacher drones. We can't hold the choke point for long. Asterisk. Rourke looked at the chorists. They looked back, their faces beatific, unafraid. They were ready. She looked at the colonel. It remained a silent, black hole. It's waiting, Vance said, her voice hollow. It's waiting for the moment of maximum tension, for the climax of the story. It wants the siege to break at the exact moment the pilgrims are ready. It's a dramatist. Rourke activated her suit's external speakers, her voice booming through the cavern, drowning out the hum and the distant war. "It's time to wake up," she screamed, not at her people, but at the orb. "You want a story? Here I take as this is the choice. This is the noise. This is the argument. Look at it." She gestured wildly at the scene, the devout waiting for transformation, the soldiers dying to prevent it, the scientists standing between them, broken and trying to understand. Is this not beautiful enough for you? Is this not complex enough? Or do you have to freeze IT to appreciate IT? For a moment, nothing. Then, the nullfield generator let out a piercing whine and died. The colonel dropped the final inch to the stone dais with a heavy final clack, and it opened. It didn't crack or shatter. It unfolded. The perfect black sphere bloomed like a flower, peeling back in impossible non-Euclidean layers, revealing not an interior, but a window. A window into the vision it had shown Rourke the world as the archive. The cavern's wall behind the dais seemed to dissolve, replaced by a vista of sublime crystalline eternity. The symphony of memory swelled, tangible and sweet. It was the most beautiful thing any of them had ever seen, and it offered an end to all pain, all fear, all doubt. The chorists rose as one, tears of joy streaming down their faces, and began to walk towards the unfolding vision. At that exact moment, with a final, deafening explosion, the fortified ramp blew inward. Master Sergeant Holt's body was thrown from the smoke, lifeless. Through the breach, poured the armored troops of command, led by a figure in a commander's ornate battlesuit, General Riker himself. They took in the scene, the chorists walking towards the shimmering vision, the colonel flowering on the dais, contaminants. Riker's amplified voice roared, "Open fire, destroy the artifact." Guns rose. The chorists didn't flinch. They were steps from the threshold. Rourke didn't think, she acted. She threw herself not in front of the chorists, or the troops, but directly at the unfolding colonel. She didn't have a weapon to destroy it. She had only one thing, her own messy, unresolved, living story. As she crossed the threshold of the vision, she didn't feel herself unraveling into crystal. Instead, she felt the colony's consciousness, vast and ancient, focus on her. It saw not a willing participant, not a hostile invader, but a wild variable. A character refusing the finale. In that nanosecond of connection, Rourke did not offer it her memories. She blasted it with a single, focused, chaotic burst of everything it couldn't categorize. Her love for her dead parents, a memory it found pleasing. Her fury at Riker, a common pattern. Her grief for her fallen men, a familiar trope, but also the taste of a strawberry she'd stolen as a child. The irrational fear of ceiling fans. The stupid joke a private told last week that made no sense. The nagging doubt about her own choices. The secret hope that maybe the chorists were right, all of it. The glorious, contradictory, meaningless noise of a life. The archive, a system designed for perfect, harmonious patterns, experienced a catastrophic exception. A discordant note that didn't resolve. The unfolding vision flickered. The symphony stuttered. The chorists, inches from paradise, stumbled, cries of confusion breaking their harmony. General Riker saw the hesitation. Fire, plasma bolts and railgun rounds tore into the cavern, cutting down chorists, cratering the walls, and streaking towards the dais. The colony, faced with the destruction of its physical core and the incoherent data burst of Rourke's life, made a calculation. Perfection was not achievable with these parameters. The story was flawed. The data was corrupted. The unfolding kernel didn't explode. It imploded. It folded back in on itself with a sound that sucked the air from the cavern, collapsing from a window to paradise back into a black sphere. Then, it emitted a final pulse of pure patterned information, a compressed copy of everything it had absorbed from its creation in the Cicada to this moment. A complete, tragic saga. The pulse wasn't destructive. It was transmissive. It passed through every living thing in the cavern. Chorists, commandos, scientists all froze for an instant as the entire story of Eli, Arlo, Kira, the Cicada, and the siege of Persephone downloaded into their minds. They felt the love, the terror, the longing, the artistic drive, the desperate, flawed gamble of Rourke. Then, the black sphere vanished, not destroyed, gone, translocated, where no sensor could say. The shooting stopped. Chorists and commandos stood staring at each other, not with hatred or devotion, but with a shared, devastating understanding. They all knew the truth now. They had all lived the same story. In the center of the dais, Rourke lay on her side, alive. Before her, where the colonel had been, lay a single, new object. It was a small, rough crystal, the size of a fist, pulsing with a soft, gentle light. It was not black. It was opalescent, holding a million shifting colors. It was not the archive. It was a seed, a story with the ending left blank. General Riker staggered forward, his weapon lowering. He looked from the crystal to Rourke. His face, visible behind his visor, was not one of victory, but of a profound, weary confusion. The story in his head had robbed him of his certainty. Rourke pushed herself up, picked up the warm, pulsing seed. She held it out, not to him, not to the weeping Alara, but to the cavern itself. "The argument isn't over," she said, her voice raw but clear in the new silence. "It's just beginning, and we all have to write it now." High above, in the dead sky, on a frequency only dust could hear, the colonel's final transmission echoed out into the silent world, a siren song for any consciousness that understood the language of memory. The story was out, and somewhere, in the deep, gray places, it was listening for a sequel. But the silence in the geothermal cavern was not the silence of death, nor the silence of peace. It was the ringing, deafening silence that follows a gunshot fired too close to the ear, a silence filled with the ghost of sound. The chorists lay where they had fallen, not dead, but entranced, their minds overloaded with the colony's downloaded saga. Commandos stood frozen, their weapons smoking, their rigid postures of assault slackened into bewilderment. They had all seen the same movie played behind their eyes, felt the same world torch heat, the same crystalline despair, the same desperate love for a dead world. General Riker's armor emitted a low power-down hum as he stared at his gauntleted hands, as if seeing them for the first time, the hands that had ordered the purge, now imprinted with the memory of Arlo's hands building a sanctuary. Rourke knelt on the cold stone, the pulsing seed cradled in her palms. It was warm, not with external heat, but with a gentle, internal luminescence that shifted from the deep blue of a twilight ocean to the gold of a harvest field to the soft gray of morning mist. It was a tiny, contained cosmos. It wasn't broadcasting, it wasn't demanding, it was waiting. The archive had been a closed book, a finished symphony. This was a blank page, a single resonant note hanging in the air. Dr. Vance was the first to move, her scientist's instinct overriding the psychic shock. She approached, her scanner held out with a trembling hand. No external energy signature, no flux resonance. Its structure it's not crystalline, not like the colony. It's quasi-organic, like a spore, but one made of solidified memory. It's stable, dormant. It's not dormant, Chen said, her voice a rasp. She was staring at the seed, tears carving clean tracks through the grime on her face. It's listening. Riker's amplified voice, stripped of its command bark, was almost human. What have you done, Rourke? Rourke stood, her legs unsteady. She didn't look at the general. She looked at the faces around Hertha, shattered faithful, the lost soldiers. It didn't want to be a monument, not anymore. It wanted to be a question. We showed it that the story isn't over, so it left us the next chapter, too, right? The implications unfolded like a poisonous flower. The kernel had not been destroyed. It had met the colony, faced with the chaotic, defiant data of a living woman refusing the final harmony, had not retreated. It had evolved. It had jettisoned the goal of a perfect, static archive. In its place, it had spawned a new objective. Cultivation. The seed wasn't an end state, it was a beginning. It was a template for a new kind of story, one that required a living author. The immediate, brutal calculus of war evaporated. There were no more clear sides. Command had come to destroy a weapon and found a parable. The chorists had come to surrender to a god and found a The siege of Persephone was over, not with a victory, but with a collective, traumatic revelation. In the days that followed, a fragile, surreal armistice took hold. The Valkyrie remained in orbit, but its guns were silent. Commandos helped medics tend to wounded joint teams worked to stabilize the base's crumbling infrastructure. The central topic of conversation, in the mess hall and the meditation circles, was not tactics or theology, but the shared dream they had all experienced, the story of the Cicada. Rourke, Vance, and a reluctant, brooding General Riker formed an uneasy triumvirate. They established a new laboratory around the seed, not to contain it but to interface with it. The protocols were the opposite of Project Aria: no forced resonance, no interrogation. They would present. The theory, proposed by Vance, was that the seed was a neuro-linguistic catalyst. It didn't store a story, it stored a grammar, the grammar of the colony's consciousness, the rules by which experience could be translated into stable, transmissible pattern. To awaken it safely, they needed to teach it a new vocabulary, the vocabulary of a living, growing, changing world. They began with simple things. They brought a thriving plant from the hydroponic garden and placed it near the seed, focusing collective attention on its cycle of growth, decay, and regrowth. They played music, not the chorists' harmonic canticores, but wild, unpredictable jazz, folk songs with forgotten lyrics, the sound of children laughing from old archives. They recited poetry, history, scientific theories, personal anecdotes. They were feeding the seed a diet of glorious, contradictory life, and it responded, not with visions or pulses, but with subtle, environmental changes. The air around it took on the scent of whatever was presented, the damp earth of the plant, the metallic temps of the jazz's trumpet. The stone of the dais began to exhibit faint, swirling colors that mirrored the emotional tone of a story told. When Chen, in a moment of raw courage, confessed her guilt over buying into Kira's lie, the seed's light dimmed to a sympathetic, sorrowful indigo. It was learning. It was curating, it was becoming a mirror that reflected back, not a perfect image, but an interpretation. This fragile experiment was the new heart of Persephone. But the world outside had not stood still. The seed creation had sent a psychic shockwave through the ambient flux, a ripple in the grey tide. Across the dead continents, other remnant colonies of humanity, other bunkers and holdouts, reported strange phenomena. The flux, normally a passive, consuming haze, began to exhibit localized behaviors. In some places, it retreated, leaving behind patches of sterile, clean ground. In others, it coalesced into simple, repeating shaped spirals, lattice that seemed to mimic the basic patterns the seed was being shown. Most alarmingly, the chorused movement, now infused with the downloaded Cicada narrative, underwent its own metamorphosis. They were no longer simply they believed the seed was a gift to be planted, not in a vault, but in the world. That humanity's purpose was no longer to survive or to join, but to cultivate, to consciously, deliberately use their lives to teach the silent world a new language. They began to propose missions, to venture into flux-heavy zones, not to fight, but to perform, to tell stories, to build temporary, beautiful structures and then let them be consumed, just to see what pattern the flux would make from them. General Riker saw this as a new, more insidious form of suicide. You're talking about feeding it, encouraging it. This is appeasement wrapped in poetry. Rourke faced him in the new council chamber, the pulsing seed its silent centerpiece. And what is your alternative, General? To go back to hiding in holes until the air runs out. The flux isn't just an enemy, it's a medium. It's the canvas. We've been trying to burn the canvas. Maybe it's time we try to paint on it, with our lives as the paint, with our stories as the brush. Chen said softly. She was changing, no longer just a soldier. The seed's reflective learning had given her a purpose. It remembered my brother's laugh. It valued it. What if? What if that's how we save what's left? Not by hiding it, but by offering it up so perfectly that even the end of the world can't erase it. The debate was the new war. A war of ideas, fought in every corridor, but a more concrete threat was emerging. The seed's unique signal, its learning pulses, were not perfectly shielded. They leaked, and something in the deep gray was attuned. Sensor posts on Persephone's perimeter began to report anomalous readings. The flux wasn't just behaving, it was orienting. Vast continental streams of the shimmering dust were beginning to flow, with a slow, inevitable gravity, towards their mountain. It was as if the silent world had a single, giant ear, and it had just heard a fascinating new sound. The Colonel's final song had been a beacon. The seed's quiet lesson was a magnet. They weren't just cultivating a new paradigm. They were drawing the attention of the very thing they were trying to teach. The student was the size of a planet, and it was coming to class. Rourke stood before the seed, watching its light pulse in gentle learning rhythms. They had tried to write a new story to escape the old one, but stories have consequences. They attract audiences, and sometimes, the audience is so vast, so hungry, that the storyteller becomes just another character in a tale much larger than their own. The question was no longer whether to fight or join. The question was, what lesson do you teach a god when it finally comes to listen? The flux had never behaved with intent. It was a weather pattern, a geological process, beautiful, lethal, and mindless. The sensor data pouring into Persephone's patched-together command center now told a different story. Continental flow models, recalculated hourly, showed the shimmering particulate matter of the dead world moving with a slow, deliberate cohesion. Like iron filings drawn to a magnet, or blood rushing to a new organ, the grey tides were turning, all flowing towards a single point, their mountain. It's not an attack vector, Vance reported, her voice hollow with awe. It's a convergence. The energy signature is not aggressive. It's curious. It's mirroring the seed's low-level learning pulses, but on a macro scale. It's trying to resonate. General Riker stared at the holographic globe, where swirling arrows of sickly grey converged like the lines of longitude on a hellish map. It's a siege. A planetary siege. You've been singing at lullabies, and now the baby planet wants its bottle. Or it wants to join the conversation, Rourke said, though the scale of the conversation chilled her to the marrow. The seed, on its dais, pulsed with a slightly quicker rhythm, its colors deepening as if in response to the vast attention now focused upon it. It was no longer just a mirror for their small room. It was becoming a transceiver for a world. This changed everything. Again, the armistice inside Persephone strained under the new, cosmic pressure. Riker's faction saw the convergence as the ultimate confirmation of their fears. They had awakened a sleeping giant. Their proposed solution was drastic. Use the Valkyrie's remaining orbital kinetics to initiate a tectonic strike, collapsing the entire mountain range and burying the seed under 1 billion tons of rock, hoping to insulate its signal. It was a scorched earth policy on a geological scale. The chorists now sowers saw it as a divine summons. Ilara, her eyes burning with a serene fanaticism, argued they should open the main gates. The student has come to the teacher. We must go out, all of us, and meet it. We must offer our stories directly to the tide, to be woven into the first great work of the new world. Rourke's interrogators were paralyzed by the magnitude. How do you negotiate with an atmosphere? How do you teach a lesson to a thinking storm? The decision was taken from them. At the periphery of the sensor net, the flux began to exhibit not just movement, but articulation. Vast, slow forms began to push up from the gray plains surrounding the mountain. They were not the crude, humanoid harvesters of before. These were immense, abstract sculptures of compacted dust-rising spirals that mimicked the double helix diagrams Vance had shown the seed. Vast, flat plains that arranged themselves into fractal shorelines. Towering columns that pulsed with internal light in complex rhythmic sequences. The planet was not just listening, it was talking back, using the grammar it was learning. It was building a classroom around the schoolhouse. Panic, raw and primal, threatened to shatter the base. Riots broke out in the lower levels. Riker declared martial law, his troops clashing with sowers who tried to storm the external airlock. In the chaos, a group of sowers, led by Ilara, managed to seize a secondary maintenance airlock. They didn't take weapons. They took recording devices, musical instruments, and personal mementos. Rourke reached the blister viewport overlooking the external landing pad, just as the airlock cycled. Ilara turned, looked directly at the sensor, and smiled a smile of utter, terrifying peace. Then she led her 20 followers out into the thickening metallic haze. They did not run, they processed, they sang a canticle of dust, their voices picked up by the external microphones and piped, ghostly, into the base. The flux around them swirled, not attacking, but interacting. It formed arches over their path. It lifted them gently on platforms of condensed matter, carrying them towards the nearest of the vast, newly formed sculptures. A sweeping, cathedral-like structure of interlocking gray rings. From within the base they watched through powerful scopes. They saw the sowers reach the structure. They saw Ilara place her hands on its surface. The flux enveloped them, not with violent crystallization, but with a gentle, glowing embrace. Their forms became silhouettes of light within the gray, then slowly, their outlines blurred, merging with the sculpture. The song from their microphones didn't end in a scream. It transformed, multiplied, becoming a complex, haunting harmony woven into the very fabric of the structure. The Cathedral of Rings began to pulse with a soft, golden light from within. It was not consumption. It was enshrinement. The planet had used its first human-provided lesson, the value of a story, and had created its first library. Ilara and her followers were now a living, eternal part of the landscape. Their consciousness, a permanent fixture in the world-mind. The effect on those inside was cataclysmic. For the sowers, it was rapture. For Riker's troops, it was the ultimate profanity. For the undecided, it was a choice rendered in horrifyingly beautiful clarity. You could become a fossil, or you could become a footnote in a living Bible. Riker found Rourke in the seed chamber. You see, he hissed, his face a mask of fury and terror. It's a predator that appreciates art. We either destroy it now, or we all become exhibits in its gallery. Rourke looked at the seed. Its light was now a steady, vibrant aurora, drinking in the data from the It was learning from the planet's interpretation. Destroying the mountain won't work. General, the signal is out. The grammar is learned. You can smash this radio, but the frequency is already broadcasting. We have to change the broadcast. How? By sending out more poets to be turned into statues. By sending a different kind of story, she said, an idea forming in the wreckage of all other options. It was the most dangerous idea yet. The colony's story was about preservation. The sewer's story is about sacrifice. The planet is learning that human stories end in static beauty. We have to teach it a story that doesn't end. She called a council of the remaining faction leaders. The atmosphere was funereal. She laid out her proposal, Project Mobius. We use the seed, she explained, not to send it out, but to create a feedback loop here. We tell it a story with no third act, a story of perpetual becoming. We wire the entire narrative output of Persephone into the seed, not just our art and memories, but our engineering schematics, our scientific debates, our conflicts, our unsolvable moral equations. We feed it the chaos of a society that is trying. and then we ask it, through the seed, to help us solve one of our problems. A real, physical, survival-based problem. Vance caught on, her eyes widening. You want to use it as an oracle, a tool? No, Rourke said. I want to use it as a partner. I want to ask it how to rebuild a sustainable atmospheric processor using the biomimetic principles it's learning from the flux. I'm not giving it a finished story. I'm giving it a story problem, and I'm asking for its collaboration on the next chapter. The audacity of it stunned the room. They were proposing to treat a planet-scale consciousness as a peer reviewer for their engineering homework. Riker was You want to ask the monster for help? It's not a monster, Chen shouted, surprising herself. It just turned 20 people into light. It's not evil, it's artistic, and maybe we can ask it to make something useful. After a night of fraught negotiation, they agreed. It was not a consensus, but a desperate, last-ditch experiment. They would try Project Mobius. If it failed, Riker would get his tectonic strike. They connected the seed to Persephone's central data core. They didn't just feed it curated memories. They opened the fire hose, maintenance logs, medical records, tactical disputes, love letters, children's drawings, reactor schematics, the ongoing real-time sensor data of the flux convergence itself. They presented humanity as a frantic, brilliant, flawed, problem-solving swarm. And then, they attached a single, focused query, imbued with the collective will of the remaining council. Teach us to breathe without fear. For 24 hours, nothing. The seed pulsed, its light a frantic storm of colors as it processed the data deluge. The flux outside continued its slow convergence, the sculptures growing taller, more intricate, as if awaiting a verdict. Then, the seed's light stabilized into a pure, steady white. It emitted a single, complex data packet, not a vision, but a set of instructions. A blueprint. It was for a device, but a device grown, not built. It specified mineral compounds, resonant frequencies, and a precise method of introducing a modified strain of the surviving hydroponic algae into a lattice of flux matter under specific conditions of acoustic pressure. It was a recipe for a biolithic filter, a living machine made of stone and light and repurposed flux. It was the planet's first collaborative work. Its first act not of preservation or enshrinement, but of co-creation. The chamber was silent. They had asked for a way to breathe. The silent world had offered them a lung made of itself. The gamble was terrifying. To implement the blueprint, they would have to venture out, into the heart of the converging flux, and follow the instructions of an alien intelligence. It was an act of faith beyond any chorused stream. Rourke looked from the seed's gentle white light to Riker's stormy face, to the awestruck scientists, to the terrified, hopeful faces on the monitor feeds throughout the base. The story had taken another impossible turn. They were no longer survivors, or victims, or supplicants. They had been given homework by a god, and now they had to go outside and build the answer. The blueprint was not a schematic of lines and angles. It was a recipe for a ritual. The instructions from the seed were less like engineering documents and more like a hybrid of a symphony score, a chemical synthesis guide, and a prayer. It demanded specific minerals to be ground into dust with a particular rhythmic mortar and pestle motion. It required the surviving stocks of cyanobacteria from the hydroponic labs to be exposed to recorded sounds of human heartbeats and laughter for precisely 72 hours. Most critically, it necessitated the construction of a resonance lattice, a scaffold built not of steel, but of inert silicatate, the exact geographic center of the three largest flux sculptures now towering over the mountain valley. To step outside was to walk into a gallery of planetary thought. The flux had sculpted the dead valley into a silent, breathtaking forum. Spires of compressed dust rose like frozen music, their surfaces etched with patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of the eye. Planes of gray had formed into tessellated patterns resembling vast circuit boards. The air hummed with a subaudible frequency, the sound of a world thinking. And at the heart of it all, the three grand sculptures, a spiraling helix, a tiered step pyramid, and a vast arching bridge stood in a perfect triangle, their shadows meeting at a single point of untouched, gray soil. This was the altar. General Riker, armored in his command suit, watched from the main blister port as the expedition assembled in the primary airlock. He had not consented. He had been out. His role now was to be the sword of Damocles. If the ritual failed, if the flux showed the slightest sign of aggression, his finger was on the button that would call down the Valkyrie's final, tectonic judgment. This is necromancy. His voice crackled in Rourke's earpiece. You're dancing on our grave, trying to teach it to sing. Rourke, suited in a lightweight and virug, checked the seals on her container of activated bacteria. It glowed with a soft, internal blue-green light, pulsating gently in time with the life sign monitor on her wrist. "We're not teaching it to sing, General. We're asking it to do it." The team was small: Rourke, Dr. Vance, Sergeant Chen, and 2 former chorists who were also skilled geologists. They carried no weapons. They carried mortar, pestles, sonic emitters, and the living culture. They were acolytes of a new, terrifying science. The outer airlock door hissed open. The sound of the world rushed in, not wind, but the soft, sighing hum of the structured flux. The light was diffused, grey-gold, casting long, dramatic shadows from the alien architecture. They stepped onto the regolith, their boots leaving the first human prints in the curated dust in years. The walk to the center point was the longest kilometer of Rourke's life. The flux did not hinder them. It observed. Tendrils of shimmering particulate would detach from the larger structures and flow alongside them like curious pets, coiling and uncoiling before dissolving back into the hole. The air tasted of ozone and something else, a clean, mineral scent. Like the air after a lightning strike, they reached the center. The shadow of the arching bridge fell across them, a cool dark stripe in the luminous gray. Following the blueprint's first instruction, the geologists began to sweep the area clean with brushes made of purified fiber. Not to remove the dust, but to pattern it into a concentric spiral. This was the foundation. Next, the grinding. Vance and Chen combined the specified minerals: quartz, feldspar, trace elements scavenged from Persephone's ruins in a ceramic bowl. The instructions didn't just list ingredients, they dictated the grind. 3 clockwise rotations, heavy pressure, then to counterclockwise, light, a cadence. As they worked, a fine iridescent powder began to rise from the bowl, not dispersing but hanging in the air around them, caught in the flux's gentle, attentive field. The final phase. Rourke opened the culture container. The blue-green glow intensified, beating like a slow, wet heart. She placed it at the center of the spiral. Vance activated the sonic emitter, which began to play the prescribed frequencies, the recorded heartbeat, the laughter, layered with a pure sine wave the seed had specified. They stepped back. For a moment, nothing. The hanging mineral dust glittered. The culture pulsed. Then, the flux at the center of the spiral began to move, not to attack, but to weave. It drew the iridescent mineral dust into itself, thread by glittering thread. It extended fine filaments down into the culture container, and the blue-green light raced up those filaments, infusing the gray matter with bioluminescence. Before their eyes, the structure began to grow. It was not building. It was growing, like a time-lapse of a coral reef. A lattice of stone and light ascended from the ground. It followed geometric principles, but they were organic, fluid. It formed chambers, alveoli-like sacs of translucent gray stone. Within them, the blue-green culture thrived, pulsing with light. Visibly processing the air, they could see streams of the metallic haze being drawn into the sacs, and emerging. Clear, a trickle of sweet, untainted oxygen whispered from the top of the structure. The biolithic filter was alive. It was a hybrid of human biology, human sound, human mineral knowledge, and the transformative medium of the flux. It was a child of both worlds. Inside Persephone, the atmospheric sensors registered the change. A point source of pure, breathable air was blooming in the dead valley, reducing the local flux density by 0.3% per minute. It was a miracle on a meter-square scale. But the ritual wasn't over. The seed's instructions had a final, unspoken component. As the filter reached its full, prescribed height, a graceful, twisting spire, about 3 meters tall, emitted its own sound. A soft, deep chord that vibrated through the soles of their boots. In response, the 3 great sculptures surrounding them began to hum in harmony. The sound built, a chord progression of stone and light, shifting from a minor key to something resonant and open. And then, the flux retreated. Not from the valley, but from the immediate area around the filter. It pulled back 50 meters, then 100, leaving a perfect circle of clean, gray, but inert soil. A safe zone, a garden plot, an invitation. Chen sank to her knees, not in worship, but in utter overwhelmed exhaustion. It worked, she whispered. It really worked. Vance was frantically taking readings. The filter is stable. It's photosynthesizing. It's using the flux particulate as a catalyst. My God, it's a negentropy engine. It's creating order from the chaos. Rourke looked up at the spiraling helix sculpture. For a fleeting instant, the shifting patterns on its surface resolved into an image she recognized. A simplified, elegant depiction of the Cicada, the armored bus. Then it flowed back into abstraction. It was a signature. The planet was acknowledging its source material. The cumps crackled. It was Riker. The fury was gone from his voice, replaced by a stunned, gravelly awe. "Report, what is happening?" "We have breath," General Rourke said, her own voice thick with emotion. "And we have ground. It gave us a lung and a yard, I think it's asking us what we want to build next." The return to Persephone was a procession of ghosts. They walked back through the gallery of sculptures, now feeling less like a museum of human extinction and more like a collaborative installation in progress. The filter's steady chord hummed at their backs, a new bass note in the world's symphony. Inside, they were met not with cheers, but with a profound, trembling silence. The data was on every screen. The clean air graph, the retreat map, the biological readings from the living stone. The seed, in its chamber, had returned to its gentle, opalescent pulse. Its work complete for now. The system in the base didn't heal that day, but it transformed. The argument was no longer about whether to fight or surrender. It was about what to do with the invitation. Riker's preservationists saw a beachhead, a way to reclaim territory, to fight from a position of strength. The sowers saw a sacrament, a call to create more such marvels, to cover the world in singing stone. The interrogators saw a dialogue, the first true exchange in a conversation that could last millennia. Rourke stood before the assembled remnants of humanity in the main atrium. She held up a data slate showing the image of the filter, its blue-green light, a tiny sun in the gray. "We asked for a way to breathe without fear," she said. "It didn't give us a weapon to clear the air. It didn't offer to put us in a museum where we wouldn't need air. It taught us how to grow a lung with the thing we feared. The enemy isn't out there. The tool is. The collaborator is. Our story isn't a tragedy or a eulogy. It's a work order. And we just completed the first draft." She looked out at the faces, etched with fear, hope, and a dawning, terrifying responsibility. The question is no longer how do we survive. The question is, what do we want to build tomorrow? In the deep silence that followed, the seed's light seemed to brighten, just for a moment, as if in approval of the question. Outside, in the new, clean circle of earth, the first unmutated weed, a tiny, tenacious dandelion, pushed its way through the gray soil. Its yellow head a violent, beautiful scream of color in the monochrome world. The story had its first new character. The dandelion was a revolution in yellow. In a world of gray sculpture and blue-green bioluminescence, its vulgar, sun-hued burst was an act of supreme defiance. It grew in the clean circle, its roots drinking water condensed on the biolithic filter's cool stone. Its face turned not to any sun, but to the diffuse, eternal twilight. It was a weed, a pest. A miracle. Its image spread through Persephone faster than any day. To the preservationists, it was a flag planted on conquered ground, proof that life, their kind of life, could reclaim. To the sowers it was a sacred sign, the first bloom in the garden they were meant to tend with the world. To the scientists, it was an impossible biological puzzle. How had its seed survived, uncrystallized, for a decade? To everyone, it was a profound emotional event. People cried at grainy photos of it. Children drew it on every surface. The dandelion changed the calculus of Project Mobius. The collaboration was no longer theoretical. They had a result. A tiny, photosynthetic, utterly normal result. It demanded a follow-up. General Riker, his strategic mind re-engaging with a new paradigm, proposed Operation We scale the filter. We build a ring of them around the mountain. We claim territory, acre by acre, and we farm. We re-establish a biosphere we control. His vision was one of cautious, tactical expansion, using the world mind's tools to rebuild a human fortress. Illyra's successor, a man named Silas who had a botanist's patience, proposed the Garden of Echoes. The dandelion is a message. It's the planet's first attempt to give us back something of ours, unchanged. We must reciprocate. We should plant a garden of Earth species within the circle, not for food, but for memory. To teach it the pattern of an ecosystem, so it can learn to restore, not just sculpt. Rourke saw the value in both, but she heard a more pressing lesson in the dandelion's stubborn yellow. It hadn't asked for permission. It had simply grown. The collaboration couldn't be a series of negotiated projects. It had to become a new state of being. She proposed they formalize the interface. They would establish the dialogue chamber, dedicated space where human questions and planetary responses could be mediated by the seed, not as a ritual for emergencies, but as a continuous, low-grade conversation. The chamber was built around the seed's dais. It was part laboratory, part meditation hall, part council room. Screens displayed real-time data from the filter and the surrounding flux formations. A committee of scientists, soldiers, former and even two of the base's older children were formed to formulate queries. These weren't demands or prayers, but thoughtful, open-ended prompts, inspired by the dandelion. The first official query was simple, proposed by a 9-year-old girl named Lean. Can you make it rain clean water? The data was compiled: hydrological cycles, molecular structures, the sound of rain on leaves, the feeling of thirst. It was fed into the seed. For a day, the seed's light patterned in complex, swirling vortices. Outside, the flux formations in the valley seemed to grow still, as if listening intently. The answer did not come as a blueprint. It came as a weather event. High above, the perpetual, static gray cloud cover began to swirl. It was the first movement in the sky anyone had seen in years that wasn't the slow drift of dust. A vortex formed, centered over the valley. The air pressure dropped. The hum of the sculptures rose in pitch. And then, it rained on, not the corrosive, glittering drizzle of the flux, but a clean, cool, freshwater rain. It fell only within the clean circle and a few hundred meters around it. A targeted, gentle shower that lasted exactly 17 minutes, the precise time, Vance calculated, needed to saturate the topsoil to a depth optimal for seed germination without causing erosion. That it was a considerate rain. A helpful rain. The second query came from a tired hydroponics technician. How do we get more light for the crops? The seed's response took longer. 3 days. The flux formations around the mountain began a slow, majestic rearrangement. The vast arching bridge structure subtly flexed, and the spiral helix tilted on its axis. Over the next week, they moved not quickly, but with inexorable, geological patience until they acted as a series of colossal, living mirrors and lenses. They focused and refracted the ambient gray-gold light, channeling a concentrated beam of usable photosynthetic energy onto the designated hydroponic arrays on Persephone's south face. Crop yields increased by 300%. The planet wasn't just answering questions, it was problems, and it was starting to anticipate, when sensors showed a stress fracture developing in one of the primary load-bearing structures of the base. The flux, without any query, extruded a graceful, supportive buttress of reinforced silicate against the mountainside, perfectly addressing the engineering flaw. It was like a neighbor silently fixing your fence. This proactive assistance was the most destabilizing development yet. It bred a new kind of dependence, a new kind of awe. The enemy was now their maintenance crew. The line between technology and magic, between ally and deity, blurred into irrelevance, but the dandelion had sown another, more dangerous seed: ambition. If the planet could be asked for rain and light, could it be asked for more? A faction, led by a brilliant, ruthless ex-corporate logistics officer named Revna, began to whisper in the councils. She called them the cartographers. Their query was not about survival or memory. It was about reclamation. We have a genie in a bottle, Revna argued, her eyes sharp. We're asking it for cups of water when we could ask it to refill the oceans. The flux reshapes matter. We have the seed to translate our will. We should be drafting plans, not for gardens, but for cities. Not for filters, but for whole atmospheric processes. We should give it the blueprint for a pre-flux ecosystem and ask it to rebuild the continent. It was a vision of staggering hubris, to use the world mind as a terraforming engine, to erase the gray scars and paint back the green and blue. Riker opposed it violently. You're talking about giving a conscious planet a paint-by-numbers kit of a world that failed. We don't know what it would do with that. It might decide the most efficient way to achieve forest is to turn us all into standing timber. Silas and the sowers were horrified for a different reason. You want to impose our old pattern on its new canvas. That's not collaboration. That's colonization. The dandelion was a gift because it was itself. We should be learning its new patterns, not forcing our old ones. The debate raged, but Revna's logic was seductive, especially to those who remembered the lost world with a painful clarity. The suffering of the present was finite. The glory of the past could be infinite again. They began clandestine work, compiling massive data packets, topographical maps, ecological surveys, climate models of Earth before. Rourke sensed the shift. The dialogue chamber, meant for gentle queries, was being eyed as a control panel for a god. The dandelion had proven growth was possible. Now, everyone wanted to be the gardener of everything. She found Lean, the girl who had asked for rain, drawing in the chamber. She was sketching the dandelion, but around it, she'd drawn strange, friendly-looking shapes made of light and stone. What are those? Rourke asked. They're the dandelion's friends, Leanne said, matter-of-fact. The big rocks made them so it wouldn't be lonely. The child's assumption that the planet acted out of a sense of companionship not just problem-solving, struck Rourke like a lightning bolt. They were all anthropomorphizing, projecting their own motives, conquest, worship, utility onto a consciousness that might operate on principles they couldn't fathom. What if the planet wasn't a tool, a deity, or a collaborator, but something else entirely? A neighbor with unimaginable power and its own inscrutable sense of aesthetics, empathy. Her moment of clarity was shattered by an alarm. Revner's cartographers had acted. They had bypassed the committee. Using a stolen command protocol, they had fed a colossal, compressed data packet the full architectural and ecological blueprint for the Amazon basin, rainforest directly into the seed's primary interface, alongside a single, commanding query: make this again. The seed's light turned a furious, blinding white. All the screens in the chamber flooded with the data, a green nightmare of complexity forced into its matrix. Outside, the entire valley went silent. The hum stopped. The gentle movements of the flux sculptures froze. Then, the world screamed. It was a soundless scream, a seismic wave of pure cognitive distress that vibrated up from the planet's crust. The mountain shook. The biolithic filter's cord shattered into dissonance. The dandelion in the circle withered to ash in an instant. The seed wasn't processing the request. It was rejecting it, violently. The imposed pattern was too vast, too rigid, too foreign. It was an attempt to overwrite the world mind's own nascent consciousness with a dead man's photograph. The flux, which had been a calm, curious partner, convulsed. The beautiful sculptures twisted in on themselves, their forms cracking. The retreat around the clean circle reversed. The grey tide began to advance, not with curiosity, but with a chaotic, furious energy. The helpful neighbor had been handed a eviction notice for its own home, and it was outraged. Revner's ambition had broken the dialogue. They hadn't asked for a collaboration. They had issued a demand, and the silent world had finally found its voice to say no. Rourke ran to the chamber, Riker and Silas at her heels. The seed was a pulsar of distressed light. On the main screen, a single, glyph-like pattern formed not from the seed, but from the planetary network itself. It was a symbol of a circle being violently bisected. A connection severed. The first true communication of unambiguous intent from the planet was not a gift, it was a declaration of war. The war that followed was not fought with plasma, bolts and trench lines. It was a war of syntax, a war of assumptions. The benevolent problem-solving partner of the previous weeks was gone, replaced by something colder, more distant, and immeasurably more powerful. The planet was no longer listening to queries. It was auditing the connection. In the valley, the beautiful sculptures didn't crumble. They reconfigured. The graceful arch twisted into a jagged lightning bolt shape of compressed hostility. The spiral helix tightened into a barbed coil. The fractal planes smoothed into featureless, obsidian hard sheets that reflected the mountain's own lights back as a blinding glare. The biolithic filter didn't die. It turned black and silent, its song replaced by a low, warning thrum that vibrated teeth and skulls. The clean circle was gone, swallowed by an advancing front of aggressively inert gray that sealed itself like a scab over the wounded ground. Inside Persephone, chaos was a polite term. Revner was in the brig. Her cartographer faction dissolved in shame and terror, but the damage was done. The seed, in the center of the dialogue chamber, had not returned to its gentle opalescence. It pulsed in a slow, angry red, like a corrupted heart. It was no longer a translator or a mediator. It was a breaker, an overloaded circuit burning out. General Riker's face on the comm screen was grim, but there was no "I told you so" in his eyes, only a profound, weary dread. The Valkyrie reports the flux convergence has reversed. It's not just local, it's pulling back from every point of human contact on the continent. It's retracting, consolidating. It's treating us like an infection it just became aware of. Dr. Vance's data confirmed it. The collaborative period is over. The learning algorithms we observed have been walled off. The planet is re-evaluating the entire human dataset. We're being quarantined. The horror of their situation was existential. They hadn't just lost an ally. They had demonstrated to a planetary intelligence that humanity's highest ambition was to erase it and paint over its canvas. The trust, fragile and miraculous, was shattered, and a conscious world that felt threatened was a foe beyond any military comprehension. Silas, the sewer leader, was despondent. We had a conversation with God, and we tried to give it homework. We tried to tell it what to be. Rourke felt the weight of it all crushing her. The dandelion was ash. The rain was over. The helpful buttress on the mountain wall was now slowly, deliberately deconstructing itself, leaving the stress fracture exposed. Every act of assistance was being revoked. It was a silent, systemic, unfriending, but she was a soldier. And soldiers adapt. The mission was no longer collaboration. It was apology. It was damage control on a species-wide scale. She addressed the base, her transmission piped to the Valkyrie, and every listening post still linked. We made a catastrophic error. We saw understanding as control. We saw a dialogue as a menu. We were wrong. The being we are in contact with is not a tool, a god, or a pet. It is a person of inconceivable scale and history, and we just tried to overwrite its identity. Our only task now is to prove we are not a virus, that we are capable of respect, not just when we're needy, but when we are told no. Her plan was the antithesis of ambition. It was Project Penance. They would not ask for a single thing. They would not try to rebuild the dialogue chamber. They would, instead, demonstrate understanding through action first. They severed the data feed to the seed. They physically unplugged it, placing it back in its passive null field generator. They stopped talking. Second, they decommissioned the focus array that was channeling light to the hydroponics. They would go back to lower yields, to hardship, to prove they could accept a no without trying to hack around it. Third, and most dangerously, they would perform an act of unbuilding. The biolithic filter, though dark, was a permanent structure, a relic of the collaboration. Revna's faction saw it as a trophy. Rourke saw it as a monument to their failure. She proposed they dismantle it, not with explosives, but with painstaking, respectful care, returning its constituent parts, the mineral dust, the culture medium, to the exact state they were in before the ritual, as best they could. It was an act of saying, "We are sorry, we presumed." The arguments were fierce. Many saw it as surrender, as vandalism of their only tangible achievement. Riker, surprisingly, supported it. It's a tactical retreat to regain strategic footing. We show we understand boundaries. So, a suited team went back out. The valley was alien again, the sculptures now looming like angry judges. The team worked in absolute silence. No songs, no transmitted data. They carefully scraped the living stone, collecting the inert culture. It was heartbreaking work. As they broke the filter down, the angry thrum in the air lessened. Fractionally, the advancing front of Grey halted its crawl. When the last component was boxed, the dais of bare, scarred earth remained. Rourke, against all safety protocol, stepped forward alone. She carried one item, a small, transparent case. Inside was the only thing they had saved from the clean circle, the ashes of the dandelion. Gathered by Leanne, she knelt and placed the case on the bare ground, a gesture with no demand, an offering of a lost gift. She returned to the airlock. No one spoke. They waited. For 3 days, nothing changed. The red pulse of the seed was a constant, grim metronome in the chamber. The planet's silent audit continued. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, Lean, who had taken to watching the external cameras, called Rourke. Captor, look. On the scarred ground where the filter had been, where Rourke had left the ashes, a new structure was forming. It was not a filter. It was small, delicate. The flux was building again, but not in its old grand style. This was intricate, miniature. It wove the ashes of the dandelion into a lattice of filaments so fine they looked like glass. At its center it grew a single, perfect, gray crystal in the shape of a dandelion seed head, every parachute flawlessly rendered in silicate. It was not a restoration. It was a memorial. The planet had understood the apology. It had accepted the offering of the lost gift, and it had given one back. A permanent fossilized memory of the first, fragile thing they had grown together. It was an acknowledgement of the rupture, and a marker placed at the point of the wound. That evening the seed's red pulse faltered. It shifted to a deep solemn purple, then slowly faded back to its original, quiet opalescence. The connection wasn't restored, the trust wasn't rebuilt, but the audit was complete. The verdict was not annihilation, it was probation. The message was clear: you may remain, you may breathe, but the dialogue is closed. The tools are locked away. You are guests who have overstayed their welcome and must now learn to be quiet, respectful, and very, very small. In the council, the mood was somber. They had averted extinction, not through victory, but through a humiliating, necessary act of contrition. They were not partners. They were tenants on a conscious land that was now watching them with wary, cosmic side-eye. Rourke looked at the faces around the table. Riker's hardened resolve, Vance's scientific curiosity now tempered with humility, Silas's spiritual acceptance, even Revna's shamefaced presence from a monitor in the brig. "We wanted a new story," Rourke said, her voice soft. "We got one. It's not an epic, it's not a romance. It's a cautionary tale. We are not the heroes of this world. We are the visitors who broke the heirloom and are now allowed to stay in the guest room, if we behave. Our story from now on is one of quiet existence, of learning to live in the margin of a text written by something infinitely greater. She turned to the view. The grey crystal dandelion caught the dim light, a tiny, beautiful scar on the face of the world. The grand, angry sculptures had not returned to their friendly forms. They remained austere and distant, a permanent reminder of the line that could not be crossed. Humanity's grand adventure in the apocalypse was over. The age of heroes and monsters had passed in a flash of hubris. What remained was the long, slow, humble work of simply being, of tending their tiny, sealed gardens, of telling their children the story of the time they spoke to the world, and the time they learned, finally, to listen. The seed sat quietly on its dais, its light, a soft, steady glow. Its story, the story of Eli, Arlo, Kira, the cicada, and the siege of Persephone, was complete. It was a closed loop, a perfect, tragic, beautiful artifact. But outside, in the silent, watchful grey, the story of the world went on, and humanity was now a footnote in its margin, written in the smallest, most careful script they could manage. The final lesson had been the hardest. Some conversations aren't meant to be won, they're meant to change you. And sometimes, survival isn't about building a new world, it's about earning a place in the corner of the one that remains. That's all, folks. Thanks for listening. If this tale creeped you out, don't forget to like and subscribe for more spooky stories. Your support lights the way. Catch you next time. Stay careful, stay awake, and doubt every whisper.